I'd like to welcome my good friend Ryan Frisinger. I've been fucking it up for a long time. I'm going Frisinger, but it's a lot easier to say. But Ryan Frisinger, who's a good friend of mine. We met just about 2 years ago through a mutual friend, Kyle Kingsbury. And, really, and I've talked with Kyle on here before. Like, Kyle's had a big impact on my life. But in a real kind of down to my cellular core, Ryan has been the one who's given me kind of the most agency to take on my own healing. And so it's an honor to have him on today. He's got a lot to share. I'm going to do my best to get what I can out of him. It's going to be a little bit more like an interview than I normally do, just because there's so much I think that Ryan has to offer. There's so much that I've learned. I know I'm not going to be able to capture all of it, but I want my audience to get an idea of some of the stages of healing that I've gone through, physically, emotionally, and then the stuff that you're working on right now and what you have to offer to pretty much anybody. And so with that, I like to start off with a little bit of background, kind of maybe what it was like growing up as Ryan and how that may have shaped who you are today, and some of those experiences along the way, which I know you shared with me, like that I think were really impactful. And it's what I love about your story in particular is that, not that you were almost on death's door, but you were in a really bad place, and that inspired you to figure a lot of shit out that, a lot of times when we're there, it's the woe is me. And I'm sure you've felt that, why the fuck is this happening to me? I was going to do good work, right? But here I am, almost dead. But it's inspired this whole, fortunately for guys like me and the other people that you've touched, you went down that road and you turned that experience, which a lot of us, again, sometimes you turtle and you don't make it out of it, but you didn't turtle. Mm-hmm. And you use that to fuel, I think, your passion and your inspiration going forward. And so with that, right, I don't want to speak too much here on your life story, but share with us some of the things from your background that you think would be important to know about you.
Okay. So I think the big thing to recognize about what I do and the work that I do with medicine, biohacking, is that I'm an interdisciplinary researcher and practitioner. And when you ask about my life story, it is all about being interdisciplinary. So as a young person, I grew up pretty poor with a single mom, and I basically had two things. I basically was a basketball player, and I had a library card that I essentially used relentlessly. And so I grew up in a family of civil rights activists. My grandmother was a surgical nurse. My mom's an artist. And so at an early age, I got exposure to world cinema and literature, and I'm naturally very curious. I'm pretty split. So we may get into something called human design at some point in this discussion, but I'm a quad split in that that particular world of identity. And so I've always kind of studied 4 core areas, and that's athletics and kind of sports training, literature and film, medicine, and then very much into plants and ecology. And so I've kind of studied all that stuff my entire life. And because of the situation that I grew up in with a lot of trauma and a lot of kind of difficulties, early in my life, I kind of knew by the age of 5 that I wanted to get a PhD. And so that knowing at an early age and also being able to recognize kind of the substance abuse problems in my family and things like that propelled me down this serious path of becoming a scholar later in life. But I also had a kind of transformative event that dramatically changed my childhood. My mom and I were hit by a drunk driver when I was 4.5 years old. She had a severe head injury, and my childhood kind of effectively ended at 4.5 years old. And so I became ultra serious, and that really catalyzed all of those interests and gifts. So I was super dedicated to scholastic stuff as a young person. I was super dedicated to being an athlete. So anything that I felt could kind of carry me out of my circumstances, I was super committed to that. The problem with that is that, as you mentioned, I did deal with pretty much a life-threatening illness at the age of 30. So a lot of that seriousness and contraction and kind of fear that was generated in childhood, that kind of was a survival type of instinct that allowed me to achieve a lot of things, also became my downfall. So trauma effectively changes and scars and damages the genetic material in the body. And so when it happens early in life, if you have enough of it with enough other kind of things folding in, you're pretty much guaranteed to have kind of an autoimmune disorder around the age of 30.
What are some of those other things that may fold in for people, just so they have an idea, besides just a basic kind of trauma regarding variety?
So the traumas, range, and they're across the spectrum. They can be physical, like a car accident. They can be emotional, a bad breakup. They can be an existential kind of trauma where you start to realize, which I did in my 20s, that the path that I was on wasn't really correct. And yet I wanted to dominate and kind of control those threads. So I knew in the back of my mind that I was heading for a brick wall, but I had no way to stop myself. The biggest consequence of trauma is that you don't love yourself. So there's a sense of lack of not deserving life itself, not deserving to be here. And so when you don't love yourself, you violate your boundaries all the time.
So it's like, it's not just not loving yourself. It's like you don't feel like you're deserving of love. You don't feel like you're deserving of life.
Yeah.
So it goes much deeper than just that love. Yeah.
And I want to speak kind of in my personal circumstance, because this isn't always the case for everybody, but I also I was born without the amniotic fluid being cleaned out of my lungs. So I nearly choked to death as a 2-year-old. And that, I think, is where the idea of not deserving to be here came from, because I'm literally on the planet and I'm already on my way out of the planet. So I didn't understand that. And so that goes on. But the biggest consequence to me of not loving yourself is you just essentially live out of alignment all the time, because you're always outside of yourself, working out too much, being a perfectionist, doing things completely out of bounds that the body desires. And so if you do that long enough, eventually you're going to pay a heavy price for it, is if other factors come in. So what are some of those other factors? Well, getting exposed to mold, getting the Epstein-Barr virus, and then just generally not being happy with what you're using your time on every day. And so it was kind of a slow building process. And then it came to a head in 2011. And I spent about 2 years in bed after that.
So unpack that a little bit, because I know the story, but you were down in
Peruvian Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was doing my PhD research. At that time, I was writing a dissertation on post-humanist theory. So I was trying to understand human identity in the context of climate change, environmental collapse. And so the shamanic cultures have super intimate, animated relationships with nature itself, and they don't exploit it in the way that, say, a Western culture does. So I was down there living with the Shipibo, about a few hours outside of Iquitos, doing research, and I was sleeping in a little tambo that essentially had a wall of mold. And I didn't exactly know what it was. And when I was there, I didn't have any real symptoms. And then I came home, definitely felt fatigued and just lethargic for about a year. So it took about a year for the stuff to manifest, but it really was that the Epstein-Barr virus, which I had mono as an undergrad, kind of came alive and hammered my inner ears, and it just kind of took me down systematically. And I think the point we also should get at here is, so I was trying to be a literary scholar. I was going to teach most likely in an architecture school, but from a humanities perspective, I was being groomed by my department in Comp Lit to teach architecture, kind of critical theory. And
I want to just right now interject and say, thank God we did not waste your resources on that discipline, because just speaking from my personal experience, have been such an important part of my life and my change and my growth and all the stuff that I've gone through in the past 2 years. You've had your fingerprints on it. And so I'm so fucking grateful for that, brother.
Thank you.
And so I want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I had been admitted to medical school a few times, and I had always kind of been called to be a healer and to do medical work. There's 3 doctors in my family. My grandmother's a nurse, or was. She's no longer with us. But I just refused the call, so to speak. And part of it was personal. It's that as growing up in a dysfunctional family, I spent a lot of my time trying to fix other people in order to make the situations livable. And
Yeah.
so I turned away from medical work as a result of that, because that was the only context that I understood it to kind of be working in.
Which is common for a lot of us, right?
Yeah.
To heal, right? In the Western culture, you go to med school. You
Yeah.
don't spend time with the shamans. You don't try
Yeah.
these other disciplines, which you have taken
Yeah.
under, right? You're learning,
Yeah.
and you've come up with your own brand of what healing looks like, which is
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, and the literary studies and literary training matters, because the stories of every person that comes into my life matter just as much as the biomarkers and genetics. So that literary training allows me to access stories and unpack useful pieces of information that basically turn genetics, for instance, into something that's alive. So let's say
story, yeah,
I call it medical hermeneutic. So all these texts of medicine, the story, the labs, the images, the genomic reports, all of those things have to be unpacked and assembled, and they have to be kind of comparatively constructed and put together so that you actually understand what's going on. Because let's say I have a genetic analysis and I have a bunch of genetic polymorphisms that I'm looking at. In and of themselves, they're meaningless, because you need a life context in order to see, for instance, how does this person respond when their heart's broken? Because those are some of the events, for instance, that trigger chronic viral infection to proliferate, or the genes that are laying in wait to kind of break you down in those environmental contexts. They get triggered by these severe life events that most of us can't tolerate or understand. And so if you don't have that element of it, you're probably not going to get any results from doing genetic work, because you can't just start treating things in an abstract way.
What's interesting for me, right? Like, so this all makes sense to me because I've been working with you for a few years, right? But what I'm often reminded of when I'm talking about things that I've learned from you with other people who haven't had the exposure, it's still very foreign to them, right? We're still very much beholden to the static tests that we take, right? And not looking at how that kind of symphony of all the diagnostics work with the life story, right? And how that's we've kind of woven together.
Absolutely. Well, you kind of have like two types of people that come in. You have people that are very material, and they're very much into their biomarkers and their lab tests. Like the biohacking world in general is very material and kind of interested in those kind of components. And then you have people that skew more towards metaphysics. So then the story itself is granted too much power and too much agency. And so they spend a lot of time basically working the material or the metaphysical world, when in fact they might just be vitamin D deficient.
And so how give us an example. Again, I'm going to stop you often because there's a lot of this stuff that I think is new for people. And just you giving, I'm not going to be able to explain it when I talk to them after the podcast. So I want you to unpack it for us.
Okay.
So what would someone dealing with the metaphysical, how would they deal with it, you know?
So just a common example, like Lyme disease or one of these severe kind of infections that takes over the entirety of someone's life to the point where they're basically disabled. They would spend a lot of time getting cleared, for instance, by shamanic healers, looking for entities, possessions, also thinking about the ways in which they're manifesting their own illness based on a lack of kind of processing of trauma. They may attempt to do trauma work. They may engage in plant medicines, ritual work, et cetera. Not to say that those things wouldn't resolve the problem, but the problem is both physical and metaphysical. And I found that in many cases, the idea of us generating our own illness, I actually don't subscribe to that at all, especially having gone through one where I did everything humanly possible to get better and didn't see any traction. I do believe that these things grab our attention at very keystone moments in our lives in order to sort of force us onto a new track. And unfortunately, it takes severe illnesses to wake you up. So some of the symptoms that I had were unlivable physically. I mean, I questioned whether I could withstand the discomfort in my body.
Wow.
But unfortunately, because of the type of person that I wasn't going to listen to anything else. So that's one point. The other point of the story, so as you know, you worked with me, a crucial aspect of the work is to complete a timeline. that outlines pretty much anything you can remember that's meaningful: physical injuries, childhood illnesses, heartbreaks, kind of failures, injuries to the body. And
Childbirth, what was interesting for me in my experience was, and if you've never done a deep dive into your own timeline, if you spend some time and you start asking questions of mom and dad, what childbirth was like, what was it like in utero, what was going on in utero. Like, I found that there was some trauma going on with my mom and dad while I was in utero, right?
Yeah.
And so there are these things that can impact your life that you have no idea until you do that deep dive. And so I think it would be it'd be interesting for the people out there to just sit down and really investigate what your actual timeline looked like. But anyway, sorry.
Absolutely. Well, the other point of the timeline is most people come to me when things are so bad that they basically are left with no options but to deal with whatever the problem is. And they've seen 50 doctors, been to the Mayo Clinic, whatever. I would say that's 90% of my clients. The other 10% are kind of people seeking optimization and NBA players. But the point is that your illnesses start in your childhood. And the only thing that changes is that the face of the illness, the symptom pattern, the signs and symptoms change through time. But if you want to heal from it, for instance, you need to go back and look at those early days. So things that I'm interested in are, does a person have frequent sore throats and ear infections, or which tells me their thyroid's already suboptimal, their body temperature's already low. How do they react to their vaccines? Did they have a sanctuary at home to retreat into their own energy, to recalibrate? Were they intermediating something with mom and dad? Did they enjoy school? Who were their peer groups? Do they like, all these things basically tell you a lot about how a person is unfolding in time. And so once we get injured a little bit in childhood, we start to already make a lot of compensations that essentially steer us into very comfortable patterns. And many of those are pretty dysfunctional. So let's say, you had a bad experience and were made fun of in school in second grade, and you might start isolating yourself, and you might start developing in a way that's out of balance away from social activity, for instance. So you need to know all of those details, because that tells you about who you're dealing with, the layers that they possess, and kind of where their weak links are in terms of being able to deal with and kind of comprehend some of that stuff. But it also tells you, for instance, how does that person's brain handle the stress of its environment? So what is it doing at the level of like the neurotransmitters or the brain energy? And so you see these compensation patterns that start setting up. But generally speaking, 99% of the people I work with, what is generating the majority of their symptoms started around 3 to 5 years old. And it just continued to kind of snowball, and it will cross multiple body systems. So it might start in your ears or your skin, and it may end up in terms of a cancer of some type if it goes far enough. But you start to see kind of global distribution of symptoms. But typically people go and see their doctor, and then maybe it's the thyroid that got their attention. But going and treating the thyroid, for instance, is very unlikely to resolve the symptoms that are kind of presenting in total. And obviously, another piece of this is the relationships that you carry and that you're committed to or in. And so what I see when couples do this work or an individual does this work is they end up coming into some pretty severe conflict with their closest relationships, because those are all typically constructed on those wounds. And people are trying to sort of work with one another and work each other's problems out through one another. And that's also part of our coming together. But it starts to unravel and reveal a lot of those kinds of tendencies and work things. So unfortunately, when people work with me, they have to be super ready for it, because it is going to kind of unmask you in a way. And it's not really my intention to do that to you.
Yeah.
But that's just part of it. I had to go through it too, and still go through it.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's to the people who've been listening to my previous podcast, that's the experience I've had over the last 2 years. Peyton and I, my wife, had our struggles, and it's without a doubt this played a part of it, right? It was like me digging in, like trying to figure out all of it, in a way, right? And it uncovers some stuff about yourself that is not easy to live with sometimes, right? And so sometimes, well, what we found that worked was fixing ourselves, right? So going in, fixing your vessel, fixing your shit, and then coming back to the relationship.
Absolutely.
And fortunately, I had a partner who was willing to do that, was patient, had her own work to do, understood that it was no longer my work to do for her. And so we took it on individually, and then we came back, and a year ago got remarried. We didn't renew our vows. We got remarried. We started fresh as new individuals.
Absolutely.
There are two things I want to mention. I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine last week, and it was so interesting. He had an epiphany. He's in his 40s, okay? And he realized that when he was a kid, you'll really appreciate this. When he was a kid, his best friend had cystic fibrosis. And he knew that he was going to lose his friend at some point. So what was his coping mechanism? He started to distance himself from him, from others, because he knew that loss was coming and it was going to be too much for him to handle. And he just realized last week that this has been a major driver in how he has developed relationships over the years. Like, he has his buddies that he has a lot of fun with, that he grew up with, but there's not a deep connection. Like he and I talk about, like, I have some deep connections. Like, like you and I met and immediately we were brothers. Like, there was this thing that we shared together, right? And I had the same thing with him. Like, but he has had a hard time. And I think he's really freaking excited that he can now deal with that and unpack that trauma and then go through and heal his relationships with his friends, his family, his wife, his kids, whatever, right? So anyway, I just wanted to give him a shout out because I'm really proud of him for doing the work, and really going inward. But the other thing that fascinated me, was one of the first times that we got together, was just this, you had mentioned it, just how the disease works its way through the different stages and parts of the body. And if you could really just kind of dumb that down for my listeners and for me, again, because I have a hard time explaining it, but that fascinates me. And how, when you work with someone, you work the symptoms almost, you work to see the symptoms in reverse, to see that it's working its way back out.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to describe it, but basically
that's good then.
Yeah.
So I haven't really been totally fucking it up. It's just hard to describe, even for someone who understands it.
No, the body, I guess the best way to talk about it is through the idea of the water in the body being kind of the most prominent element in the body. So the body is very non-local. So like, why do we have a body made of mostly water? Well, water has infinite receptor sites and it can cause non-local reactions. And so, for instance, let's say I'm, early in my life and I pick up what I believe is just a run-of-the-mill cold, which in fact is actually herpes family virus 4, which is Epstein-Barr. I have a sore throat and I notice that it comes back periodically and they think it's strep, but it's actually Epstein-Barr. Well, in the beginning, it's going to affect my spleen and my liver and my blood. But as it lays dormant and as it takes over my immune system cells, because it doesn't possess DNA, over time, it will start to then affect my central nervous system and then my inner ears. And as a result of that, it's going to start affecting things all over the place. And then as more and more things come into the body, you're just going to start to see global distribution. So you will see, for instance, to someone who has kind of a theme where their skin is the locus of the problem. So they have maybe psoriasis or eczema and they rash up and they kind of start there. Mm-hmm. You have people where it affects them more cognitively. So they notice that their brain function oscillates and they have mood disorders and things of that nature, and it gets worse and worse. And then it just becomes very nonspecific, like brain fog. Well, these things can affect you in lots of different ways and they have a trajectory, but what they're doing is essentially proliferating throughout the body. And as that happens, a couple of things will happen to you. You end up becoming a servant to the things that are in your body infectiously. So you start eating in ways that support them. Your digestive tract gets permeated. So then you get things into your bloodstream like proteins that shouldn't be there. So you can't make antioxidants or B vitamins anymore because the gut bacteria do that. And if you go on long enough, the metabolism gets injured and then your genetic material gets damaged. So there are a couple dominant theories of cancer. One is that it's a somatic mutation, meaning genetic mutation in the cell. We now know that that's not true, even though science continues to behave as if it is. It's really a metabolic disorder. So all these things put pressure on your energy systems in the body within the cell. And so you can just throw up a lot of different symptoms. To give you a sense, a single autoimmune disorder can generate 200 distinct symptoms on its own in a year's time. There's something called mast cell activation, which are immune complexes. It's kind of like the emergency responders of your body. So it's a toolkit of cells and immune complexes that open up on the scene of an injury. If you have mast cell activation syndrome, which many people that I work with have, you can have 500 symptoms in a year once it starts to unravel itself. And for context, I think it's important to know, like, one of the things I'm big about is the human body is poorly conceptualized. So we need to be thinking of ourselves as an ecosystem that houses life itself. So I could have the paragon of health in front of me, a person who has no symptoms, sleeps perfectly, no emotional trauma, so to speak, and that person will have 6 infections in their body. So
how are we being exposed to these infections? Like, I think traditionally people are like, oh, my knee's infected. Like, you see the infection. You're talking about these infections that kind of somewhat lie dormant, or
yeah, they live in us. And so it's a very complicated thing to explain in the sense that we don't really know. Mm-hmm. So for instance, viral infection has had an evolutionary effect on the human species, and it has a lot of effects on other species in terms of changing our gene expression. But there's the kind of dose makes the poison. So, like, for instance, Epstein-Barr is interesting because it's made stronger in an environment where we have molds and heavy metals in the body, but it in and of itself has been studied to remove, for instance, mercury from damaged landscapes. And so
wow,
it was looked largely as a beneficial infection. And now it's stronger and it's essentially awakened to its own power and it's super sophisticated. And so it's itself out of balance. So there's very complicated kind of like esoteric and existential questions about infections, but generally speaking, we sort of identify ourselves at the surface of the skin and by our face. And the reality is that we're a multiplicity of things, least of which is human. So when you start thinking of that nature, you're a seed of life itself that's organizing it. And it's kind of like a Russian doll effect where the human is representing kind of a piece of the holograph, right? And all the other species are too. So infections get in the body all kinds of ways. They're mostly entering the body through just aerosolized particles.
What's that mean?
So like if somebody coughs, the proteins of the infectious agent itself comes out that way. Because we have domestic animals, a lot of the zoonotic infections are coming from our pets. So like if I have a person with a lot of animals, I'm going to see all the parasites that the animals carry in the human, that has this pet. So, and so many things are invisible. So like even the most fatal molds are not really visible to the naked eye. And so there's this whole kind of symphony, but I think the bigger problem is it's not that infections are inherently bad or that these pathogens are inherently bad. It's the language we use. It's just that our bodies have become so weak at the level of the terrain that they become much more powerful and have an ability to hijack your system. And basically what these infections do is they break your tissue down in order to liberate nutrition for themselves. So they basically are eating you from the inside out.
Okay, so I'm going to use this as a fucking perfect segue, right? Because I feel like we've given people like the down and dirty. Some of this doesn't feel good to hear, right? No. So now let's talk about the work you're doing, right? And how you can take someone in that state, right? And start to build them back up from the inside out.
Yeah. So I know we'll get to some of this later, but one of the things that's kind of on the agenda for today is to kind of talk about unlearning and rethinking and doing things like that. So most of functional medicine that would be somewhat able to handle some of these things, or naturopathy, has focused mostly on the use of nutrients and dietary change to change people's physical health. And of course, that's a part of what we did, right?
Yeah.
Part of it was understanding genetically how you're interacting with certain chemicals from food, like sulfur, which we can get into here in a minute. But that's the nuclear side of the body. And the nuclear side of the body is not where the problem is. So my work these days and my work when I worked with you is still similar to that. I work on the energy cycle, the Krebs cycle, which is in the cytoplasm. That's the water body of the cell where you're making proteins, where the mitochondria sits, the nucleus is within that. But that's the part that's damaged in most folks, and the cell membrane itself is damaged. So you have to kind of start by getting the battery of the body recharged, hydrating the body properly so that it can retain its electrical structure. And then you kind of can stimulate with the medicines that I import from Germany certain elements of the mitochondria to help you make energy more efficiently if you're weak in those areas.
And so when you say hydrate,
Yes.
it's actually twofold. It is actually with water, right? And it's a little bit of a different type of water than people are maybe familiar with. But it's not just hydrating so that when you go work out, you have enough water in your body. It's actually hydrating the cells. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So kind of the one thing you're getting at is that water in nature is structured, and it's done so because as water flows through hydrological systems always towards the oceans.
What's a hydrological system?
The flow patterns of water, like how water moves through landscapes,
Like down the mountains, through rocks and
through
minerals.
the stream, minerals, yeah.
Okay.
And then also the evaporation and rain cycles
Okay.
that are in the atmosphere. And so as water does that naturally, if you go to any naturally occurring waterway that hasn't been altered by man, right, it has a kind of snake-like structure. It moves, it's curvilinear. And within that, the water ends up making kind of figure eight movements. And as it does that, it gives it a geometric structure, a lattice. And because it's getting mineralized, that mineral content, the electrolyte content, allows it to be electrically changed. The bond angle, hydrogen bond angle of the water changes. So it's all pretty complicated stuff, but I'm going somewhere. So the best way to think of it is when you have water with a certain type of geometry and a certain chemical makeup, it doesn't mean that it's dissimilar from other things. So I'm going to give you an example here. So if I took all of the elements, and it's funny because your son just gave me a shirt with the periodic table on it.
You can show.
Yeah, it's a really
From my
cool,
son Bowen.
really cool shirt. Here.
I wear this shirt periodically.
Yeah. Yeah. Shout out to Bo. So if we took a diamond and we took a piece of coal and we just broke them down to their constituent parts, they'd be very similar. But if you try to give your wife a coal ring as an engagement, that wouldn't go very well. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is most of the water that we're getting out of our faucet basically does not have the right constitution to interact in the body appropriately. So what is water doing in the body? Water has to come into the body and it has to form into a gel. And so when we think about how that works,
and this is considered what phase?
Fourth phase.
Let's talk about what are the four phases?
Well, we have liquid, solid, gas, gel.
Okay.
Or plasma.
Liquid, solid, gas, and then the fourth is gel. And there's a book, right?
What's the fourth phase of water, Gerald Pollack, and then he's got another one called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. So
this is a new concept for me. So I want you to kind of unpack. I mean, I know it. When I met you, it was new for me, and I've tried to explain it again, like with varying degrees of success to my friends. Yeah. So if you could just kind of unpack what it means, the importance of it.
And so this concept is like volleyed around quite a bit, but people don't really actually possess an understanding of it. So people talk about the fourth phase a lot, but really what does it mean? So pretty much all of us have made Jell-O in our life. So you have these proteins and you add water that's heated that has a kind of kinetic charge to it. And if you add that to those proteins, it becomes gel. So in the human body, cellular ATP, which is the energy that is made through the mitochondria through oxidative phosphorylation, the ATP is not really just energy. It's the heat source that allows proteins to adhere to water. So when the proteins start to fold in those watery areas of the body, you get that gel state. And so when people's health starts to fall apart, it's because those intracellular gels essentially through inflammatory processes dissolve and they become watery and they become liquid when they need to be in a gel state.
So the cells,
Sits in
instead
these
of
intracellular matrices with all these gels.
so it's gel, and that's ideal. And then
is.
as people get sick, these gels become dehydrated. They turn into
Yeah.
water, and then the cells now aren't actually communicating as well. Is that
That's
part of
part
what's
of
happening?
it. The other thing is, if you were to look at cells, or you think of sacred geometry or Fibonacci spirals or the golden ratio, if you look at any organisms that are alive, they have these spatial relationships that are absolutely perfect geometrically. And so when your water's in the body, those gels aren't forming, your cells don't have the proper geometrical relationships to one another. So if you think of the difference between a mass of cancer and a mass of cells, well, a cancer mass is pretty amorphous and poorly shaped, and it had the geometry, the stuff is stacked together, they're adhered to one another. And so
Okay.
all of these things in the body require these perfect relationships. And the reason for that is the body basically does things without using energy. It's super efficient. So if you look at it, it's almost like a zero energy system. It's a very efficient system. So when those gels break down, the sodium potassium exchanges in the cells don't work properly. And so you lose a lot of the energetics of the cell. So
Okay.
inflammation, the purpose of it, let's say I've got an infection or a metal in a fat soluble tissue or somewhere in the body. If I dissolve those gels periodically, it gives me a chance to detoxify those things out of the body. So it's not as if they're always in a gel state. Things are remodeling all the time in the extracellular matrix. But when you're continually not replacing that, and then you have content in the body that doesn't allow those gels to form, you're going to get into trouble at some point in life. And then the cell membranes themselves, which are made from phospholipids, once those start to become leaky, you just get a lot of inefficiency in how energy is made. You get a lot of reactive oxygen, superoxides, a lot of damaging molecules. And so when somebody comes in to work with me, like, I can pretty much assess the health of their membranes, and there are going to be more sophisticated tests where you can look at like nucleotides in the urine and see how much DNA is being damaged. But
Okay.
you're basically starting at the same place with everybody, assuming that their energetic system and their waters in their body are not functioning properly. Because all the symptoms and the chemistry and the neurotransmitters and the hormones, you're going up into more kind of solid structures. And if you don't have those generative kind of cytoplasmic outcomes where they need to be, you're not going to get those things. So we move a lot of variables if we're going to work from the top down. People go on hormone replacement, thyroid hormone replacement. They take, antivirals. They do all these different, or let's say they're a biohacker and they're doing bulletproof coffee or fasting or whatever it is, right? Well, sometimes that stuff works, but more often than not, there's not the scaffolding or the structure in the body to amplify those signals. And so people don't really get very far like that. Or they do the work, and then as soon as they pull out all those interventions, they just fall apart again because there's actually no structure in the body.
Oh, it's back to the old. You gotta, like, if you're gonna play basketball, you need to learn the fundamentals. You have to have that foundation. So
Your base.
your body has to have that cell at the cellular level needs to be healthy. And so there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on. One, you had mentioned unlearning, and yes, like, not only is it an important part of what we're talking about, right? But it is an overarching theme with this podcast, in my own experience, has been understanding that it's okay, that I reserve the right to change my opinion, that I don't need to, defend what I believed maybe a year ago or a week ago even, right? And I spent a lot of time trying to do that with varying degrees of results, mostly poor results.
Mm-hmm.
And so with regards to that, what is, and again, you've listened to Ryan speak for a bit here, like, you can see he's learned a lot. And so unlearning for him, right? It's the same for us. Like, it's not easy, because you start to believe something, you share it, you're working with people, right? Like, hey, this is the right thing to do. And then in a year or 2 years, more information comes out. Like, you need to be able to change your opinion, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the problem in Washington, right? Is these politicians, right? Mm-hmm. Not that I really empathize with them, but if they change your opinion, they're flip-floppers, right? So now they have to, they voted on something 30 years ago, they have to somewhat defend it, right? And so it's kind of silly. And I kind of steal that example from Jeff Bezos. I read a great piece from him about that, but it actually gave me the agency to say, you know what, like I don't need to, because I used to say CrossFit was the best thing to do. It was the best thing for me to do at the time, and I didn't understand the nuance of explaining that to someone. Right now, I do. Now, hey, this is what I'm doing. Hey, I'm riding the Peloton. I freaking love it. I love it, right? And you're like, Cal, you love it, fucking do it.
Yeah.
And so, but again, back to this sense of unlearning, what is something that you've had to unlearn that was maybe kind of difficult at first because you did believe in it, and like in this journey, like to where you are today, what is something you've had to unpack and kind of relearn?
So I'm going to kind of give a longer answer and get to it eventually. But I think one thing that needs to be said right away, I have an academic background. I did doctoral work. And there's a famous book called The Structure and Function of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it basically gets to this idea that you're talking about. The humans make decisions as if they're kind of boarding the Titanic. And so we invest, myself included, I spent all of my 20s and half of my 30s in pursuit of kind of an academic career. And when you have a lot of time invested in something and you have a finite life, it becomes much harder to disentangle yourself from those types of endeavors, even if they're completely wrong. So the idea of course correcting is something that we're not very good at. So to kind of put that into the context, when you first start getting acquainted with ideas about the human body, for instance, you are kind of presented with this idea that there are kind of infinite ways in which someone can influence the body itself. And one of the things that I've learned both the hard way, thank you, and kind of learned through just being stubborn about it is that the body is actually kind of a black box. It has very few points at which you can get into it. And what I had to admit to myself on the first hand is that what you learn a lot of the time is a protocol that someone has put out there that is completely abstracted, and the actual content of that protocol isn't exactly transparent. And so this is where we get into biohacking. We can talk a little bit about my thoughts around biohacking, but oftentimes people are running around implementing protocols that have absolutely no individualized component. The second thing is, as a practitioner, especially as you become influential and people really look to you as a master, you have to be your biggest critic and you have to be honest with yourself about what you do and don't know.
Amen to that, by the way. Yeah.
And too many people drink their own Kool-Aid. And so definitely things have changed that I've done, and they've become more refined. They definitely have, in terms of character, a reflection of the past. But you should get better all the time. And you should get better into the point that you actually discover some degree of truth. So what I'm getting at is that my work has gone from kind of loosely applying different types of interventions with some degree of mastery of the actual science involved to understanding the fundamentals of things. And I've gone from biology, chemistry, molecular biology, genomics, more to physics. And so even in the paleo world, Rob Wolf, for instance, who was a former client of mine, he's completely against physics making its way into medicine and actually thinks that it's kind of like snake oil. Well, in fact, in my experience, physics governs and drives everything biologically. Light, for instance, is kind of the most important factor in human existence and all kind of existence on the planet. And so I've had to go and actually do the work and understand quantum biology, quantum physics, biology, simple organic chemistry, transformations of nutrients, because there's so many things that outside of an in vitro environment or a science environment that don't make sense to us. For instance, how do minerals change forms in the body? That's considered impossible, right? But it happens all the time, these biological transmutations. So I've had to really check myself and really become super informed, and reading books like by Richard Feynman, a famous book called QED, which is Quantum Electrodynamics, which looks at all these strange phenomena of physics on the body and really understanding simple chemistry. So what I've learned, if you understand the really simple actions that happen organically in systems and in living systems, you can all of a sudden start to do a lot more profound work. But then you also find out that a lot of the stuff that everybody's following doesn't work at all. Again, unless there's scaffolding. So the major problem that I see is one of literacy. So how does one make sense truly of their labs, of the supplements, of the food they eat? Where's the consciousness around it? How do they understand themselves, especially when they're essentially just following protocols that are being disseminated at large by very influential people? And so it becomes very tricky, and it also is very tricky to keep people on the line because their compliance maybe has been good to those things, but it doesn't generate those results. So
Yeah, in those protocols that you're talking about, let's just say from Western doctors and stuff, like I want to be clear, like in most every case, these are well-meaning people as well. They're doing the best they can with the information that they have, right? And they just understand it on a different level. And so I think it's important for people to know that there can be some, they can move the needle in some ways, but if, it's been my experience, right? And now it's my opinion that in order to really make the, kind of create the effective change that I think a lot of people want, you need to really take in the whole symphony of these things that you're talking
it's
about.
very difficult too, because
it's a moving target. There's so many,
and you have
it's
to
the
start
whack-a-mole almost too.
Not to toot my own horn, but the only reason I can do what I do is I started at 4 or 5 years old, having comfort with reading across multiple disciplines. So,
and the as you mentioned before, the human design, can you talk a little bit about, I want to stay on this topic, but just so people understand like how you and I differ, right?
Yeah.
How our learning maybe differs.
So my human design, my type is the investigator martyr. So it's called the 1-3, and that person is here to solve problems and to experiment.
And I will link to this in the show notes so you can learn all about human design. And we have an amazing friend of ours, John Cole, who dives deep into this stuff that we've both worked with extensively. My whole family's done our human design with John, and he's phenomenal. And so I'll link to that in the show notes.
So part of that 1-3 is to just figure out things and then try and not get bogged down when like being punished for being wrong. So like definitely I've done things that don't work, and I've recommended those to things, and I'm very quick to recommend something if I feel very confident in it, even if I haven't tested it extensively. Sometimes that backfires, but I'm also a quad split, which only 0.5% of people have, which means that
that's a half. It's just 1 out of every 200. How's that? There we go.
Yeah, and that means that essentially you've got four distinct individuals living in a body. And so that set me up for interdisciplinarity. But one thing I want to bring up, so in anthroposophical medicine, which is probably the most profound version of kind of a Western medicine that I could come, and it's not Western in the sense of allopathy, Western naturopathy.
Is this like a Thomas Cowan?
Yeah, it is. And Rudolf Steiner is who's the formulator of anthroposophy. But there's a famous line that the anthroposophical physician has to know everything. And so like, there's no way that I could do what I do if I didn't have extensive knowledge of music and literature and philosophy and medicine and all of that, right? Like, because I bring all of it to bear. And why do I do that? Because I'm trying to see what sticks after you've put it under a critical lens. So for instance, let's say I don't even know how to think critically or evaluate, for instance, science itself. And all I do is base my interventions on studies. Like there's someone like Rhonda Patrick out there who's very well respected, but she just essentially disseminates scientific studies.
Okay.
They're very abstract. Like, 200 grams of sulforain from broccoli sprouts is shown to upregulate X. What does that mean? And is that meaningful, especially when the study was 10 people, very particular people? There's all these kind of unique factors. So what I've seen is that you need to understand what drives human existence metabolically, and then go from there. So one of the things that's on the docket, what am I working on these days? Cancer, explicitly, metabolic restoration, because to me, I figure cancer is the end stage of any type of long-term dysfunction in the body. And it's not a foreign process, it's us. But understanding how to reverse that gives us an insight into what the body needs to thrive. And it's the optimal waking and sleep times. It's taking care of your circadian biology, drinking water, eating genetically appropriate foods that you're going to process, dealing with your emotions. It's not a whole bunch of other things. And it's not a biohack and it's not a supplement. Most of it is an alignment with the environment that's extremely hard to find because of the nature of a kind of near complete genetic mismatch between the modern world and the human body. So that's kind of the humbling aspect of it, is the body does its own healing. No one is healing the body. The body is being given an opportunity to heal itself. And that's also, as a practitioner, a part of the unlearning, because there's a lot of ego in this industry where I hear people, I healed all these clients. I mean, you actually didn't. You're maybe providing a guide, but you know the work that's involved. It's very difficult. Very few people execute it.
And you have to own it yourself.
You do.
And one of the things that I love about the work that Peyton's doing, she's trying to decide what her title is, right? And she's not comfortable with the word healer because she's like, I'm not healing anyone. What I'm trying to do is give them back the power to heal themselves and show them the different ways that they can do that, right? And we both understand that when you can take on your own healing, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, however that manifests for you, like, it's fucking powerful. But like when you're constantly giving it away, and I'm not saying like don't go to people to learn, right? No. I mean, I'm learning a ton from you, but I have to execute it, and I have to figure out what of these things actually makes the most sense for me. And we talked a lot about this in the beginning. Like, you would ask, how do you feel about this supplement? How is this one working? And it's like, I couldn't tell about this one. I really liked this one. There was something intuitively that I knew about each of these things. And if I wasn't really feeling it, like, we're not going to do that anymore, because it's back to the biology of belief. If I don't think it's working, it's really not going to work.
Yeah. I mean, 99% of the time that's true, unless, you have pathogens speaking for you. And then oftentimes they'll misdirect you from things that are helpful. But, there's a lot of layers to it. But I think overall, like, I'm not just talking about Western medicine. I have a big problem with like biohacking in general, because I feel like it makes a lot of promises that it doesn't keep. And the reason for that is there's just not a lot of transparency around like these sort of abstracted interventions that don't really make a lot of sense when you're trying to actually develop a foundation from which to evolve. Like, you can move around again. It's very top down is what I'm getting at. And so healing also definitely is all about the consistency and showing up. And in my own experience, the more that I desire to live life itself and also to be here, the more able I am to do the simple, regular kind of activities that generate health. And it's a very long-term process. And the other thing is there's really nothing to go out and seek. I think the thing that we've talked about extensively that's been a big part of your transformation is the idea of actually filling in the space of effort with just being, because everybody is out there trying to become something, trying to heal, trying to, look good, to compete, to grind, whatever it is they're after. They want to get to these performance mountaintops. And the problem with that is that those are ephemeral states, and they become something that you can't live without. And if you can't live without it and you can't color your reality in a more peaceful, quiet way, it becomes very hard to do anything long-term that's health sustaining.
And I think I want to pause there for a second, because that is, again, another major tenet of why I am doing this, right? It's because I spent 40 some odd years in that kind of doing state, in trying the performance, whether it was fitness, whether it was as a trader, whether it was how I was eating, whatever, as being a dad, right? It was more doing the dad thing rather than being the dad thing. And so just understanding that I don't need to fill my time with the doing. And I think that's a key thing. I mean, I'm going to beat the drum on that until this podcast is shut down, because it's had such an impact on me to just be okay with things as they are unfolding, right? And to not fill that space, and just to sit in that discomfort, and to allow whatever the opportunity is to present, and not jump at everything that comes because it seems kind of good, right? Like, it's back to that that premise of it's either a hell yeah or a fuck yeah, or it's no, and you really need to be selective, because I spent many years getting pulled in different directions and not understanding the essence of being. And one thing that just came to mind with the whole biohacking community, and there's a lot of great work being done out there for sure. And
Yeah,
that's not at all what you're saying,
yeah,
but
no.
I really appreciated. I just listened to Luke Story had on his podcast. He had on Bruce Lipton. I'm a big fan of both of those guys, and it was awesome to hear Luke talk about his neuroses around EMFs, right? And just as I'm listening to the podcast, he's talking about how he's like moved to a different place in California because there was less cell towers and whatever. But then in his apartment, right, he's got such shitty cell reception that he needs like a router or what, I don't know what the technology is, but he needs that, right? And so it's next to him, and now he's worried about that. And Bruce is like, brother, like you're creating more by telling yourself that you are vulnerable. And if you actually believe that you're not vulnerable, that will have a much greater impact than all these things you're trying to do to shield yourself. And I love that Luke came around to that, and he was just like, fuck, I've been kind of doing this all wrong, And so I think it's important for people to understand that the EMFs, like these things are important to wrap your head around. But if you really get sucked into this idea that you are super vulnerable, you're going to be vulnerable. And they're like he's like people who live under the power lines, right? People have a higher incidence of cancer, but not everybody gets cancer. So what happens there, right? Is there some biology of belief within that? And I'm sure we could spend an hour just talking about that, but I just think it's interesting that with all that you're sharing, I think people need to take a few deep breaths and not start stressing about all the things they need to do. And we'll get to that further on in the podcast about a few of the big things that people can do, the least amount of work to have the maximum dosage or the maximum response. And so I thought it was important to kind of bring that up so everybody can take a second or two, take a fucking deep breath. Everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency to overcorrect. So
that's how I do all my shit. I way overcorrect, dude. And I eventually come back to center.
With all due respect to Bruce Lipton, he's kind of wrong about EMFs. I would vehemently disagree.
So tell me about that.
Those areas where there's high rates of cancer around power lines, nuclear power plants, waste facilities, the link that drives cancer is poverty. I actually did research at the Center for Sustainable Cities on this problem. It's an environmental justice issue.
No shit.
So it isn't a belief thing. That's actually a way in which those issues have been made to go away. Poverty is the biggest problem. Poverty scars the DNA. So it allows epigenetic modifications through things like electromagnetic fields and power plants to do more damage to the body.
So they are literally more vulnerable. Their cells are more vulnerable.
Absolutely, because they're both impoverished financially, these folks. And I grew up in an environmental justice area here in Austin. Also, they have a lot of malnutrition. They live in food deserts.
Sure.
So
explain a food desert for the
food
audience.
Desert is essentially an environment where no matter how hard you seek out healthy food, you just can't find it. Let's say I'm in South Central Los Angeles, where I happen to have gone to high school, and my mobility is poor. I maybe have the bus as a transportation option. If I have to go more than 4 or 5 miles to find a healthy piece of food, I'm in a food desert. And so traditionally, food deserts are populated by liquor stores and fast food and other things. And there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of them around these areas of toxicity. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that I see, and this is a much bigger issue, probably not the scope of this podcast, but we are both individuals, but we live in cultural conditions, milieus. And climate change is dramatically affecting our ability to not act both for the commons, but for the self. And so when we think about these things, it's not just about like getting EMF shields. It's also about politically participating and trying to not allow them to be so prescient and so present. So Austin's going to be one of the biggest 5G Wi-Fi, kind of crucibles in the world here in this next year. And so it is a big problem, but it's definitely also a huge problem where I would agree with Bruce and Luke is that, yeah, I mean, these things are here. And psychology 101, right? The only thing we can control is our response to X. We can't change. Well, sometimes we can change it, but more often than not, we're just trying to surrender to what is and try to carve out a life outside of that.
Sure.
And so getting back to kind of your point of that quietness and stillness, like 8 humans are primates. The primate is known to be lazy. The primate is known to spend most of its time idle and leisure. We do have creative drives. We're definitely world shapers and all of those things, but there's a way in which kind of the things that we're seeking and trying to run away from also end up kind of ensnaring us. And there's also what I will agree with Bruce Lipton on is that our body is super powerful. I've seen at least one incurable disease of every category completely heal, to know that there's no such thing as an incurable disease. Either we don't know how to intervene or that person can't get in alignment. But our body's damaged, depending on the person you talk to, 70,000 to 700,000 times a day at the genetic level. The repairs are instigated immediately. And even when we look at genetic mutation, oftentimes it's one nucleotide out of a million or a billion that's actually malfunctioning.
Okay.
And so there's never been a time where we just were walking around the world not harmed by the environment whatsoever. I mean, part of our desire to build structures and live in those environments that are protected from the environment is to start to mitigate some of that. But I do think that like EMFs, part of our failure as a species is to we love creating technology, but we don't have a way to rein it in or to understand the ethical futures of it. And so we end up in some situations that end up being kind of globally disseminated that we can't control very well. So EMFs, I used to consider them more conspiratorial, probably not affecting us at the level until I started to understand what they're doing more. And then I started to really become quite scared. And I do believe that as they unfold, we're going to see skyrocketing rates of cancer because of the difference between 5G and 3 and 4G and the effects on the water in the body. And so
what can people do in the meantime? Right,
I mean, simple stuff is just turn your router off at night. I mean, turn the fucking thing off, put it on a timer, put your phone on airplane mode. Try to spend an evening out in front of television in blue light, which proliferates cancer cells at night.
And are you a big fan of the
wearing the glasses? Yeah. Most of them don't do much because they're just a pinhole of light going around will kind of render them. But the true dark glasses, which they have both night and day versions, they're pretty good if you're willing to wear them. What I have done in my house is I put bulbs in the light fixtures that are a red spectrum that don't trigger, melatonin suppression through blue light. They're not blue light. And then I do watch Netflix longer than I should, but I try to dim all the devices and do what I can. Thankfully, I live in a more rural environment, but I do think if you have the opportunity to live a little bit outside of town, it is probably a good move. I can't tell you how many people I know as clients that live in high rises in Chicago, New York, Austin, who they move in and their ears start ringing continuously and they have skin ailments and all that. As soon as they leave those buildings, everything gets better. So I do think it's just really having a healthy relationship to your technology, which is very difficult to have. And I'm guilty as hell of having a way too overdetermined relationship. But I do think these things matter. But I think what I want to really say is if you're worried about EMFs, but you're eating like shit and you're overtraining and you're staying up, worry about that and then do something about the EMFs.
Okay. Great call.
Because it doesn't make any sense to worry about that when you're not even taking care of the foundations.
Yeah. And to be clear, what I know of Luke story, he he does all those things,
He does.
right?
He does.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So he's taking care of all that. And so he's now on to the next layer. And again, I'm be very interested to hear how his mindset has shifted since he sat down with Bruce, and to see if he's taken it to heart and really worked on that. I'm guessing he has.
Probably.
You know,
he definitely evolves pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
Other thing is just knowing what your rationalizations are. So like I had a client who I heard through the grapevine was upset with me for recommending a toothpaste that had a dye in it. Okay. Well, the cost benefit analysis of the toothpaste is very positively in favor of the benefits because it was developed at UT and it removes plaque and tartar and keeps your time in between cleanings up to a year or two. Has one dye that's fairly inert. So that's an example of me changing my belief, because before it was natural or nothing, right?
Yeah, right.
But this same person
nuanced, folks. That's
But this same person has broken a toe and has problems with it and has taken 6 airplane trips in 1 month's time. So is the toothpaste the worry, or is flying in an airplane a bigger problem? The cognitive dissonance, and I'm saying I have my own versions of this, plenty of them, rationalization. But I'm saying, like, when you really start thinking about like what you're maneuvering around to fix or correct or get better, you need to really understand like your blank spots, your blind spots, because oftentimes the stuff you don't recognize as a problem is the one that's kicking your ass. And it's very subtle, and it's that fishbowl effect. So the stuff that you're really intoxicated by, you can't even see it because it's so inborn. So that's kind of what we're getting at, and really just being solutions oriented and doing what you can. And that's where things like meditation and self-love and these kind of cliche things that everybody talks about do factor in significantly. Because really the best thing that we can do is spend a lot of time idle and doing nothing. And that's kind of our best medicine and defense after having all those basic things taken care of to any of these things in life.
Yeah. So in essence, we're giving people permission to just fucking chill out, to just be, to relax. Like, you don't have to, have this undying, unrelenting desire to achieve and accomplish and do all those things. There's a time and a place for that.
Absolutely.
But if it's really filling up your day after day, you're going to burn yourself down, and you're going to miss. I mean, I only speak from experience. You're going to miss a lot of what's going on in your family, your life, your friends in general.
You do. Yeah. I mean, you think about there's an essay, if your listeners are interested, it came out in Harper's in 2004. It's called "Quitting the Paint Factory," on the virtues of idleness.
Okay.
It's an excellent,
we'll link to that.
Yeah, it's an excellent essay just on why we need to be idle. And keep in mind, in 2004, the iPhone wasn't here yet. And so it's become even more important for that.
Shit.
And there's, or the iPhone or the Android, whatever.
Yeah, no.
The Galaxy. But the spaciousness that exists is always there, but it's much more difficult to inhabit. And like, I always try to think about why childhood is, even if we've had a hard one, it still has a lot of amazing elements to it. And it's because of that spaciousness, the timelessness, the not being in a hurry, the allowing of yourself to go on tangents and to be fully immersed in the world, that you and I had an opportunity to, because our generation, I didn't have cell phones, and I had a Nintendo. I came into that generation, but
which is fun.
It was awesome, but I did spend a ton of time out in the woods and playing in the dirt and all of that stuff. So, and you start to find the more you do that, like you said, I think the biggest change is you realize there's nothing to strive for, which is its own kind of strange state, because as I've talked to you many times, as I've gone through my own, like, it's weird to be demotivated.
Yeah. Well, that's how we look at it, right?
Well,
that has a little bit of a negative connotation, doesn't
even
it?
myself, like, I was a Division I athlete, played basketball, weighed, 170 pounds for most of my life. And in the last 4 or 5 years, I'm in the worst shape of my life, probably, at least body comp wise. But it's crazy because I actually don't care that much. And it's because I actually think I'm all right as I am. But there was, 5-6 years ago, if I was 2 pounds up on the scale, I'm at an extra CrossFit workout.
Yep.
or trying to diet my way out. I'm immediately fixing it, but again, missing the total point of why I'm even in that position.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of the ongoing battle. And it's funny, like once you're in more of that idle spaciousness, then you start wrestling with other problems, which is the
It's
problem.
never ending.
It is. It
right?
is. It's a process.
But if you
that never
surrender
ends.
to the process and be okay with it, right?
You need to be able to laugh at yourself too.
Yeah, fuck. And that's that. I've had that message come through often. It's just like life is a game. It's play. You're supposed to play. You're supposed to be engaged in the game of life and have fun. And to your point, like, and I've spoken about this before, but it was 2 years ago when I weighed maybe 20, 25 more pounds, and I had all this muscle, and I was walking around, everybody buttering my nuts about how good I looked and all that. And it's like at the end of the day, there was a lot of baggage that came with that, right? And as you and I started to work, one of the things you said is, I need you to just chill out on the hard workout so that you're scaffolding, right? So that you can take in these different remedies, and so your body is not trashed all the time. And so what do? I go to the extreme. I didn't do a fucking thing. And over time, I started to lose the muscle, and it was challenging the ego a little bit. And I came to a place we go in the summer. People hadn't seen me for 10 months. They're like,
yeah,
dude, what's going on with you? And I'm just like, oh no, like I'm not that guy. But it didn't take long for me to just own that and understand that was just my ego fucking with me. And I'm okay. I'm a better person now, even though I don't.
Well, and you
walk
still
around.
Look good. So, I mean, let's be honest. Yeah. You might not be rocking the same bicep measurement, but
when I sit next to Kyle, I look like a little man.
Yeah.
Where before I used to be able to at least hang with him a little.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Kyle's an outlier, though.
That's fair.
He's like the LeBron James of Caucasian man. But no, I mean, I do think like the irony for me is that when I was my fittest, 6% body fat, my self-esteem was terrible.
Oh, brother, like trying to live up to all the things you felt like you had
all
to
the
be.
things that I was seeking, like attention from women and just feeling worthy and the way the clothes fit and just being able to, I had to have that in order to walk into a room. When I was teaching at the university level, I had to feel like I had to look a certain way to stand in front of the class. My self-esteem's higher than it's ever been, and I'm the least fit I've ever been in that regard. So it's really interesting. And I'm not saying where I'm at. I now am finding the right why. So now
you're on the path, brother.
Yeah,
that's the beauty.
Well, now I'm like, I want to eat this way that will reduce my body fat levels because I just want to live longer and because I'm excited about my work and I want to be here as opposed to I want to be, 172 pounds at 7% body fat walking around.
Right.
And I need to do this many workouts and do these types of things. So it's a different thing, and we'll see if it's sustainable. You mentioned at some point in the questions, I'll be honest as hell with your listeners, my biggest vice in the world is high fructose corn syrup and sodas. It took another recommitment to cancer research to finally put the sodas down. Yeah. I've been soda free for 3 months.
That's amazing.
And I do believe I'll never have another one.
How many were you having a day?
I wasn't having one every day, but I would have 4 to 5 a week. And honestly, they taste like shit. And that was just my way to get dopamine. My thyroid, it doesn't work all that well at times.
Yep.
And I like them.
Where do you sit with the Zevia?
Oh, that's probably fine.
Okay.
I like the
because that's my new thing. And
yeah, you want to have a little something. I mean, Zevia is fine. Even the live sodas that are made here in Austin that are like kombucha sodas, they only have about 6 grams of sugar.
Okay,
those are probably okay. And I'm all about like our ancestors, if they found fruit or honey, and they were gonna hit it and gorge on it. But just being more responsible about it. But it's just an example of like I've worried about all those extraneous EMFs. But when you're drinking high fructose corn syrup, I was on the fast track to multiple cancers. So, I mean, it's just that process, but it's funny. It's funny because the healing and the alignment is always there. And it's a choice, but it's a choice that often you have to make second by second in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting.
Unless you're really disciplined like you are. You definitely are one of the most disciplined clients I've ever had. Once you had the protocol, you were on it.
So it's I'm glad you brought that up actually, because again, there's a shadow side to all that, right? And so, but no, and I finally, it occurred to me recently that being as disciplined as I am with a protocol, it became so much about doing the thing that whenever I veered off that, just like Luke, right?
Yeah.
It's like whenever I veered off it, I would beat myself up. If I had a cupcake or fucking 15, whatever, like it had a much greater impact than just the sugar. And so I've learned that when I get a protocol from you, right, and it's funny, one of my best friends, his name's Greg Booth back in Chicago, and a little story here, side story. We all were doing CrossFit together, right? And there was a famous quote, right? I don't know who said it, but it's, my warm up is your workout.
Yeah.
Right. And and so when me and Regs and Turts, when we would all just go balls out every workout, right? Greg, he got a nickname Ocho Cinco, because he would go 85% fucking all the time. He was like, you guys are idiots. And he was right. We were fucking idiots because we were burning it at both ends and not recovering. And he would just skate through at 85%. He looked great, felt great. And so it occurred to me recently that that's how I have started to live my life, right? As important as nutrition is to me. I used to fight for that 87, 90, 95. Can I get it to 100? Can I be super disciplined like so-and-so that I'm seeing on Instagram, right?
Who's not, but yeah.
Who's not?
Yeah, exactly.
Fact.
Exactly.
And so I started to really just almost color my entire world, right, in that whole 85% world. And it's allowed me to move freely through the world and not beat myself up when last night I had a tiramisu and then I had a couple of these little chocolate cookies that the kids had, and I had a pizza and it was gluten-free, but it had some cheese on it. And like, I've let down all these things I feel like I need to be. And I think just back to what Bruce was saying, like when you're trying to live in that 99th percentile, you expose yourself to vulnerability when you don't. And it has such a bigger impact on you, right, than if you're not living that way. And so if I can, and the other thing is, if I'm trying to live at 99% in nutrition, there's a bunch of other shit in my life that's falling by the wayside and is living at 70% and 50% and 30%. Absolutely. And if you can just across the board go at 85%, you can fulfill a lot of your obligations and you can live your life in a way that is more aligned to what you're talking about, right? And so we're not saying working out's bad. And we're not saying like working your balls off when your workout's bad, but it's like understanding your why of why you're doing the things you're doing. And it's, don't just look at your training, look at your nutrition, look at what you're doing for meditative practices or other working in practices, right? Like, are you so adamant about doing these things that you're forgetting why you're doing them? You're just doing, you have them on your list of things to do, and there's no sense of being with them. It's just a sense of accomplishing them. And again, I only speak from experience because when you introduced a bunch of these modalities to me over time, I was trying to do all of them, right? And you're like, dude, play with these. And I was trying to do them all every day. And so what happened was I had no intention behind them. It was just doing them for this fact. Yeah. And so over time, I started to, the upside of that is I became proficient in some of these things. And then I started to understand like, oh, I really like being outside with my shirt off and with my feet in the grass. Okay, so that's a thing that I'm going to do regularly because it feels good. Right. And you can start to pair these different working in practices, right? Meditation in the sauna, perfect, you know? And then the cold plunge right after. Like you can put all these things together. And I'm going to go down a list of these things that you and I have worked on together later in the podcast, and we'll kind of touch base on all that. So I don't want to get too far off base here, but let's pull it back. Again, I want my listeners to know the breakdown of people you work with. And I think you talked about that. A lot of people, the majority of the people you're dealing with are sick with cancer or autoimmune diseases. And then you've got other folks like myself who are trying to just optimize, right? take me through, or take the listeners through what it looks like when someone like me comes in and I'm not really presenting anything. What does it look like? What does a consult look like? And then what are the protocols that you and I have been working with?
Yeah. So we'll start with like the demographics. So I would say 90% right now are people with complex health problems that are autoimmune, mystery illnesses, cancer. Um, a small percentage are professional athletes, and I've worked with professional cyclists. I've got several Division I track athletes that I work with, mostly young women that are sprinters and runners. And then I work with a handful of NBA players, and started that. That was really where I started my practice with some Golden State Warriors guys back in 2012. 70% of my practice is female. I found in general, women are much more ready to do this work. And I'll just be very transparent about that. So when somebody comes in that doesn't have any demonstrable health problem, that is looking to more find balance, kind of where you came from, maybe more insight into the blueprint of themselves and balance. Oftentimes there are things there. They just are not on the visible radar. So the process is not actually that different between a person with tons of problems and a person without any identifiable problems, because we're still at the first level getting acquainted with that person and their story and who they are. Most of us are not in an ideal situation health-wise. And so the difference, I guess, between somebody who, let's say, has cancer or complex autoimmunity and somebody like yourself is with that particular group of individuals, the ones that have less health problems, I'm going to look at kind of starting to reboot awareness of how their process unfolds day to day and kind of what they do, to get a sense of kind of what they're after. Because oftentimes when folks come to me for optimization, they're looking to continue that process of burning the candle at both ends. And I'm all about minimum effective dose. So that really, to me, makes sense physiologically and everything. So I kind of try to figure out where that isn't being applied. And to the point that you were making previously, where are their efforts being placed, and where should they be placed? And is there misalignments there? But that still requires the timeline and the biomarkers and the genetics.
You got to do the fucking work, right?
You're
you're not just going to come in and give someone a blue pill.
No,
it's like,
I wish I could, but I can't. Yeah.
Okay.
The folks that come in that are really sick are a different problem in some sense, because on the one hand, they're very committed to the idea that they can't get better, a lot of them.
Belief system.
They expect me to save them typically, and I'm willing to hold space in that regard. I will try to hold and prop people up and restore their hope. That's a big part of what I do. But you've got to work through that. You've also got to work with de-learning the diagnostic that they've been given, because a lot of people who are really sick, myself included, they're after a diagnosis. As soon as they can get that, it does allow that belief to form, and they start to crystallize all the symptomology. And I'm all about, like, I don't care about the diagnosis. I care about you, and I care about you getting better, but the label to me is irrelevant. You don't even need to tell me it, because I'll figure it out anyways.
So again, when someone, they've done studies, right? Yeah. Or maybe it's more, if you tell someone they have cancer, they will basically develop cancer, even if they hasn't shown up. Is that correct? Is it my understanding?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely.
I mean, not definitively, but like, what's the research say?
Well, I mean, the diagnosis typically doesn't itself produce any healing. It actually produces typically a downward spiral, which is kind of what you're getting at. So that could actually be manifesting a cancer, or it could just be surrendering to whatever the ideology is around the disease. So like our cancer outcomes in terms of therapy are super poor. So as soon as you hear that, you automatically assume that you're pretty much fighting death at that point, which is not true. And I would argue that cancer is less sophisticated than viral infection. It actually is pretty treatable. But it gets to the core of the lifestyle.
And we're going to get to how you would treat.
Yeah, go into those things. The other kind of dynamic within this is working with young children. So a big portion of my practice now are kids with rare genetic disorders. I worked a lot with autism, And those are particularly difficult cases because the parents have to kind of get into a state of forgiveness around themselves.
Okay.
They blame themselves. The males typically take a hit as an ego. Their progeny is defective, and therefore their, their masculinity is defective, and you have to work through that. But I've seen kids as young as 4 months in my practice with very serious complications. And those are trickier cases because you're having to sort of go through side channels in order to access that person's agency, especially when they're an infant and they don't speak. But I've seen my average age in my practice, which is an interesting point to dovetail back to Luke's story and Lipton talking about environment and whether or not you should think it's as affected as it is. My average age was about 46, 47, and around 2015, 2016. Now it's in the low 20s. And it's not because I'm not still seeing 70 and 80-year-olds. I am, but I'm now seeing 4-month-olds. So I'm getting 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids manifesting autoimmune disorders that you would only see in people in their 40s and 50s. And a part of it's just their constant repetitive access to technology, C-section birth, no breastfeeding, a lot of kind of vaccination injury. There's a lot of things that go into that, but I do think that it's starting to skew more towards children. The interesting thing, to get back to diagnosis, of all of these children, and no disrespect to their parents and their beliefs, not one of them really had a rare genetic disorder. What they had is issues making creatine and making their energy cycles robust enough to support the huge demands of a young growing person for growth. And so let's say I do have some dormant genes for XYZ syndrome that may kick in, but that's not the problem. So the common denominator of all these children is really bad mitochondrial function, poor energetics, demyelination of the nerves, and things of that nature. So diagnosis is really tricky. When I was really sick, to talk a little bit about myself, one of the things that was said to me that put me into a spiral is that I was using my ears to have a nervous breakdown, because everything started in my ears and it was very uncomfortable symptoms. And I saw a doctor and that was literally what was said, because they couldn't see what was going on. Well, it was Epstein-Barr in my inner ear irritating the nerves. And that wasn't visible in a scan at an ENT or, a look into the ear. And so doctors can almost, to use a shamanic term, perform bruja on their clients by diagnosing them and telling them that they're incurable.
What's bruja mean?
It's black magic. It's essentially like cursing you.
Yeah. Unintended, obviously. Let's be clear.
Sometimes not.
Okay,
yeah.
sure.
I've seen there's a fair degree of sadism in medical and science in terms of the personalities that it selects for. Whole nother conversation about who does science.
That's going to be podcast number 2 that we do together.
And I'm not, like I said, I'm not poking, I'm not trying to be dismissive of anyone, but we just need to look at that context. Mm-hmm. I think also the other things that come up in this is obviously who's your company, right? Like who's surrounding you. So I have a lot of individuals who are really ready for transformation, but they are not supported in that by the closest people, mom, dad, loved one, children, whatever.
Husband, wife.
Because as you mentioned in your journey, like you show up to this crowd that knew you and your body composition is different, and all of a sudden you're not the same cow.
You're not, yeah.
But you are. You're actually probably a better version.
Yeah.
So like you see a lot of that. And what's interesting is that healing is communal as well. So like the individual ends up carrying the torch for those around them in that regard. And so a lot of kind of what I do with people is to kind of plant the seed of legacy breaking and like carrying the consciousness for it that is required to heal, to kind of move the epi phenomenon of your genome forward, requires this really deep committed thing. So when people say, I want to get over Lyme disease, I want to be free of Lyme disease, my goal for them is to be comfortable sitting in the dark alone in their own energy without having to be somewhere else. And my goal is for them to have a why to have their human body like aligned with. So like just being symptom free is not motivation enough. Then you run on your willpower, you run into all those self, debasing kind of ways of talking to yourself. And so a lot of that early work is just figuring out, hey, what is their why? Is that why going to be sufficient to get them forward? Where is their self-judgment? And what are the likely places where they're going to trip up? Because I'm pretty confident about giving you the right blueprint. But the blueprint is fairly insignificant in relation to all those other factors. And so a lot of it's assessing those things and where your agency is. And one of the things that I fight a lot that's incredibly frustrating is I will put my knowledge up against anybody on this planet, but I can say some stuff. And as you mentioned, people are not acquainted with it. And they'll go to their primary care or something and be told, oh, that's snake oil. Oh, that doesn't work. Or they just are uncomfortable with it.
Very dismissive, sure.
And so people will often grant their authority to people that are really not the responsible party to be guiding. And so that's an interesting thing. And that's where biohacking becomes powerful, because biohackers have emerged in this interstitial space of the failure of kind of biology and medicine. But yeah, this. I know I'm kind of off topic here, but unfortunately, the majority of people I see are way down that line of illness. I would love to be catching them prior to the manifestation of all of this stuff, but that's who finds me, and that's who I work with, and that's who I was, and had to kind of arise out of those ashes of being completely debilitated and living in all these ways that was completely destructive.
Yeah, and I think that's how most of us learn, right? It's through those, like I talked about my tendency to overcorrect or to go to the far end of the extreme, right? Whatever that is, it could be drinking, it could be whatever, exercise. In living in that space, as long as you have an awareness when you start to pull back in towards the center, let's say, and just having an appreciation, like I needed to go there to understand that I don't want to live there anymore,
right.
And unfortunately there is some collateral damage that happens, and you just need to forgive yourself for that. And hopefully you have loved ones that are as forgiving as well. And if not, then you just have to move on, I think.
One thing I forgot to bring up that you were saying, so like going off the wagon, so to speak, and beating oneself up for that. Like I try to build in those pressure releases now. Like, hey, if you're gonna binge on a cupcake, make sure it's gluten-free or something that's somewhat less damaging, but schedule it. Sometimes you have to schedule your off-roading to release the pressure of trying to be perfect, because this whole idea like that we're living in now, when we were living in a less controlled agricultural world, we had no ability to control the parameters of anything. So you're damn right, we're going to go off-road if we can, but there was a better balance that was generally generated by the environment.
Sure.
So you couldn't become your own worst enemy. And that's one of the things I appreciate about Rob Wolf's Wired to Eat book is there's a reason why we have a porn epidemic. There's a reason why we're glued to cell phones, why we like sugar. We're wired to do it as much as possible when we get in contact with it.
I see.
It's all about those dopamine receptors. So like, that's a big part of working with people is seeing them, acknowledging them for who they are, giving them permission. And as far as like the support network around them, interestingly, if you look at the genetics of couples, generally speaking, they're 98% similar.
Really?
I've seen, like I said, and I've told you, families where there's the parent and then there's 3 children. I've worked with all of them. Everything looks normal, looks like general kind of nuclear genetic transfer, and the kids are all adopted, but they could have been biological offspring. So that's we're amazing. Attracting each other at that level too, which means that there should be more camaraderie in the effort. But like that's a really interesting thing for couples, particularly because you're both probably fighting the same demon. And it's there's really no negotiation. That's the other thing, like about this life that I've learned. I remember it's probably in a samurai book or something, or Japanese philosophy, like for the novice, there are many paths. For the master, there's one. That's kind of what we're also talking about is self-mastery, because you start to realize all those exit ramps and distractions. And like you said, that laundry list of things that I may bring up that could move your needles. Yeah, you don't need all of them. But if there's one that's centeredly in your path, that is one you do need to commit to.
Yeah, what are you called to do? And I didn't have that nuance before. I didn't understand.
It's hard. Nobody does. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that these are things for you to call on, and what are you drawn to? And I just want to shout out my daughter Hope, because as you said, the scheduled kind of off, the dietary. We've recently, over the last month, I get 1 sweet per week. And she holds me to it. And it was a couple of weeks ago. They had these amazing cookies from Tiny Boxwoods, amazing. And so I took it and I cut it up into 9 pieces, and I would just circle back through the kitchen every 30 minutes or so and just eat one little piece. And she just kept her eye on me, but she's been a great support system with that.
Yeah, that's a good strategy.
So let's dive in a little bit into some of the stuff that I've been doing down at Xenogenesis.
Okay.
And that's the Ryan's place that he's opened up down on Martin Luther King down here in Austin. And we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. But let's talk about some of the protocols that I've been doing and the kind of the why behind them.
So Xenogenesis was open, and it's a joint venture of myself and my partner Julie, who's a massage therapist. And it was open because, as I've been mentioning throughout the podcast, most of our interventions are chemical in nature, or what I would describe as orthomolecular, meaning that we're moving molecules around. We're doing it with diet, supplements, and that is a kind of level of scale that's a little bit higher than where the body begins in terms of that scaffolding that I keep circling back to. So what Xenogenesis is designed to do is to incorporate the elements that are in the natural world that have historically modified the human body, whether it's at a genetic level, at a level of perception, and to take those forces, localizing them through technology and then amplifying them through higher dosage. And so what you're doing is a combination of the use of oxygen, pulse electromagnetic fields, and then light in order to successfully travel through a biochemical or set of physiological pathways so that one intervention or one therapy is coupled with a therapy at the next sequence that is capable of controlling for whatever negative outcomes that are generated. To give you an example, when you do oxygen therapy vis-a-vis EWAT, which is something called exercise with oxygen, you're essentially aiming to increase the amount of O2 in the cells and to reduce hypoxia and to have higher levels of oxygen saturation. But the intervention itself creates a lot of oxidative damage. And so you need to clean that up in some way. And so basically what we're doing with you is we're decoupling your red blood cells, improving the vascular flow of plasma in your blood, and we're creating a state where it can uptake oxygen at much higher levels. And then we're using an exercise response in order to make the plasma receptive to oxygen so that the physiological exercise response can drive that O2 into the cells. It's very different than hyperbaric and arguably more effective because it's not using osmotic effects. And after you're done with that, we're essentially scavenging the reactive oxygen and a lot of the oxidative metabolic byproducts that we don't want through the light. And we're also using the light therapy to downregulate the nervous system so that it is more balanced, so that you have that initial hit and that difficulty of the training side, which, we've kind of discussed. There's the really difficult that leaves you on the ground and kind of thrashed. And then,
and that's called the Sprint 8.
The Sprint 8.
And that's a 30-second full balls to the wall effort, minute 30, real easy.
Between 8 reps.
8 sets of that.
Yeah.
It's a ball kicker.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest workouts ever. And if you can go 31 seconds, you haven't done it right. So we do that for a lot of reasons, and there's really nobody around doing it with the EWAT. So it's much harder than it actually is just without the EWAT. But the goal with all of this is to kind of also walk you through a choreographed experience of charging your energy cycles, giving you a challenge physiologically, and then bringing you back down. So rather than just grinding you, as opposed to like back in the day of the CrossFit workout where you come in and you just hit it as hard as you can and you're on the ground. You don't necessarily feel super well in between those workouts. Your hormones certainly don't respond favorably. So what we're trying to do is to give you the best of all those worlds, and using the natural linkages that these particular interventions have. And so in nature, all we're doing is upregulating light and oxygen and these electromagnetic fields and doing it locally. And then we're engaging in protein repair. so that your proteins fold and can actually repair themselves and generate a gene expression that's favorable. So yeah, I mean, you're going through our signature protocol called the Elements, and it really only takes about 45 minutes. It's not a long-term thing. And so at 2 times a week, 3 times a week for 6 to 8 weeks, if you're a 50-year-old person, you could probably take 25 years off your vascular system. And the difference between doing what we're doing as opposed to just going and moving through like periodization protocols and things of that nature is that when we physically alter your metabolic machinery, it does not go back. You're actually fundamentally transforming these things. And then you have some degree of maintenance to perform on this alteration, but you're upgrading your physiology or making it younger. And so you actually have longstanding benefits that are retained without effort. And so the most a person can do this workout is 2 or 3 times a week. And it's not just a workout, these 4 therapies that are combined.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, like we did the Sprint 8 for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And then I just recognized that it was something, it was actually taking me down emotionally down this CrossFit hole where it was like, I can't go there. I can't go to that place anymore. Or I don't want to. Actually, I don't want to go there. And so there are many ways to create that environment without, but if
you want
to be fair, if you want it, it's there and it's amazing.
If you don't, it's also, there's plenty of alterations.
Yeah, I did the other one the other day. There was 20 seconds, 2 20-second efforts that were hard.
Yeah, but
they were awesome.
Yeah. And some people just lay down and breathe the oxygen. So, I mean, it's not like obviously working with compromised people, they're not going to come in and do a Sprint 8, but I find that it helps the metabolic flexibility that's required to be a high level athlete. So it really builds a hybrid vehicle essentially on the energy side of things. And there's a bunch of hacks you can do around it with super starch and other things and really legitimate keto eating and things like that to really extract more out of the Sprint 8.
Talk about just real briefly super starch because I started to use that. So just break it down real quick.
Super starch is essentially a corn product that's been heavily modified in the lab to essentially behave as if it's a fat in terms of its release of energy. And so it's a carbohydrate source, about 22 grams of carbohydrates per serving, and it releases very slowly over a window of about 60 to 90 minutes. The interesting thing about it is because of the release of the way that it releases the energy, it doesn't spike insulin. As a result of that, an individual retains their fat store availability. And so you basically are able to draw on the fat stores in the body while also using the kind of glycolytic ATP production. So you essentially are utilizing both of the energy streams that the body has to generate energy. And so what you notice, for instance, in sprint workouts, if you're metabolically adapted, and I've seen people do much better when they're actually keto along with the super starch, but what you find is that you don't build up the lactate and you don't get the burn in the legs that shuts you down, and you don't get the claustrophobia of the EWAT because you're actually flushing all the metabolic waste from the muscle. Super starch was invented for children with glucose and kind of glycogen storage issues where they would have to eat continuously in order to essentially stay alive, because otherwise they had a pretty short lifespan and would die. So it was originally invented for glucose storage problems, glycogen storage problems, but now we've seen that it's a high level of performance.
It tastes great. It's not the best thing to mix. Sometimes it gets stuck on my bottle and stuff, but
it's pretty chalky.
But I love the way it tastes.
Yeah. And so like there's some NFL guys, the Baltimore Ravens put their linemen on it and their D linemen and O linemen on it. And those guys' body comp all improved with no other changes because it made them more insulin sensitive. So it's a pretty great biohack. There's a bunch of other stuff like I'll use bicarbonates and all kinds of other things to generate a sufficient CO2 to actually be able to bind oxygen to the hemoglobin. So there's like a lot of different things that we can do.
I really just want you to do your best you can to really dumb that one down. There's a lot of big words there.
Yeah, so
bicarbonate,
sodium bicarbonate, potassium bicarbonate, all of these bicarbonates are essentially alkaline buffers that operate in the blood, and they're there to kind of create chemical reactions. And
what's an alkaline buffer?
It's just meaning that it's a mineral that has a pH, above whatever 7.2.
Okay.
And So alkaline minerals definitely they buffer acidic wastes. So
That's good.
that's good.
They come into the
It,
body, they take out the acidic
they
waste.
help to clear it,
Okay.
chemically.
What's something that would be considered an acidic waste, just so people can understand?
The lactic acid that you build up, like, lifting or sprinting,
Yep.
that
Like
causes the pain.
when you're sprinting on the assault
And
bike
your
and
thighs
your
are on fire.
legs are on fire,
Yeah.
that's okay. Perfect.
And you have to have a really fine balance between acid and alkaline, bases in the body, because you don't just want to be fully alkaline, right? You want some of that acidity. It's important. But oftentimes, like people that overtrain, or let's say I'm an athlete and I'm more anaerobic and I'm a fast twitch dominant individual, so I perform better in hypoxic environments,
Which is
meaning without oxygen. So
Okay.
there you're running on a sugar metabolism. So you're a sprinter and you're really adept at shuttling glucose and generating ATP very quickly that way. Well, it's a very dirty fuel and very low fuel economy, but it's very quick and you're designed to go for very short periods of time. But let's say that I start to overtrain and I start to require an effort that's 15 minutes long with those longer intervals. Well, you're going to get rid of the glycogen really quickly and you're going to be out of it very early on in that workout. So what will happen is that those individuals, their O2 saturation on the EWAT will go super low when they're on positive oxygen, because they don't have enough CO2 to participate in the chemical reaction to utilize oxygen.
And so for those people, what do you recommend?
Sodium bicarbonate. I use just baking soda and lemon and give them, I put them on an alkalizing kind of baking soda mixture for about 10 days. That's taken twice a day to restore their buffering capacity. And then all of a sudden they do well on positive intervals.
This was something you recommended for me, correct?
Yeah.
And I haven't instituted it yet. But.
So like I have a client who, and on an O2 saturation, you should be above 96 really at all times. And there can be differences on right and left side of the body. When you work with us, almost 100% of people enter the EWAT on 100% saturation because of the preliminary work that we do. And that's kind of our signature, trade secret protocol. But on the other hand, like this lady, she'll drop into the 60s and 70s because she's overtrained and doesn't buffer the kind of metabolic waste properly. So when she goes negative, which would really harm a normal person in the sense that they wouldn't be able to tolerate it, would be harder. She goes up to 99% on the negatives. So she's inverted in that sense. But when you're training for, like she's training for the New York Marathon, she's sponsored. So you can't do that. You can't go anaerobic for 26.2 miles, right? Like no one could. So
right.
So you have to work on that. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can monitor. But minerals typically allow you to get more out of oxygen work because you have more of an electrical current flossing through the body. And there's just a lot of little biohacks that I'll use depending on people. And then, of course, we give and we recommend that people drink the ionized Japanese water that we use, which in the biohacking community is really split between whether or not that's a good or bad thing. There's plenty of people that are against ionized water because they're always focused on pH and not antioxidants.
I was going to say, so walk us through, because I know a lot of people, myself included, I don't anymore. Although when I'm at Whole Foods and I need water, like I'll sometimes I'll grab an Essentia, or I'll grab the, what's the one that's in the bottle there that's really good? The
green bottle?
Yeah.
Oh, it's
Mountain something?
Yeah, like Mount. I can't remember the name. It comes from Arkansas. It's amazing stuff. It's probably the best water on the market.
Okay, so
that you can buy.
I'll start to get that stuff as well. But you'll go there, right? And there's all these Essentia and whatever the Whole Foods brands that have all this pH in it. So explain. This is important. I think really important for people to understand the difference between that and what you're talking about with the Kangen water machine. Mm-hmm. And then I also want you to share your thoughts on LeBron and how much money he spends on the Essentia type water.
So most of the alkaline water on the shelf is created by adding bicarbonates, which I just talked about.
Which can work.
Yeah.
In given... depending on what your goals are.
Yeah, I would argue probably doesn't do much because you have alkalinity, but you don't have the extra hydroxyl ions, which are what are generated through ionization. So I'll get to that in a second.
No, I was just going to say, like, if I'm gonna do the protocol with the lemon for the 2 weeks, right? Like,
that's very different than those waters that are made like just chemically raising pH doesn't really mean a whole lot. That's a much more natural way. So you're better off just drinking the green bottled, really nice spring water that's
Yep.
very clean, and then just mixing your lemon and bicarbonates that way, and
Okay.
and splitting the two. So people basically fake alkalinity because chemically you can measure it, and you've added the bicarbonates to raise the pH. They're alkaline, so they're going to raise it eventually.
Yep.
Water that's structured in nature and water that is structured via ionization uses electrolysis to break the hydrogen bonds and to essentially add an extra hydrogen molecule. So it's hydrogen rich water. In fact, when I run the Kangen machine and it runs at a slow pace, if I take a lighter to it, it will pop. You can actually light the hydrogen that's coming through the faucet.
Okay. Now we have one of these at the house.
Yeah.
And we've been using it since I've known you. And I'll link to it in the show notes, just so people can have a better understanding about it. But I want people to pay attention here because this is part of what I call the big three. Right?
Yeah. So it's a different water. It's H3O. And so you have an extra antioxidant, essentially a hydrogen molecule that can interact in all these important places in the body. So biological hydrogen, which is known as NADH in the human body, is important, but most of the time the human body has a heavier form of hydrogen in it called deuterium, which we can talk about a little bit. But those additional hydrogen molecules essentially allow you to scavenge free radicals. They allow the body to generate energy. It donates hydrogen to all sorts of molecular processes. And so ionization is one of the only ways to do this naturally. The way it happens in nature, if you were to take a collection of sacred water sites that have known to produce quote unquote miracles, they're struck on average several thousand times a minute by lightning. So lightning striking bodies of water that also happen to be cold and also moving through kind of these figure eight forms are the areas where we have these sacred waters. Well, the Kangen machine is essentially localizing and using kind of electrical technology to do that. And there's a lot of ionizers on the market, but that's the only one I actually think does anything.
And it actually, the water passes through these metal plates, right?
Platinum plates.
Platinum plates.
And the machine, I forget how many is in the Kangen, 7 or 9.
Yep.
And you have to clean it periodically with citric acid, and it depends on the mineral content coming in, how much of the electrical reaction you get. But that water is electrically changed, and it has a different hydrogen bond angle. The problem that a lot of folks have with it is like they focus on the 9.5 pH. So like Ben Greenfield and a lot of people have criticized it. Thomas Cowan has criticized it. But the reality is I often have people drink the 8.5, the lower pH, because all I'm after is the antioxidant value of it and the hydrogen value of it. I don't care about pH because the pH is tightly regulated by the blood and the kidneys and different areas. Kangen water does have an extinguishing effect on localized tissue inflammation, can really help the bowels function better. If you look at colonoscopies of people that drink it long-term and clean up their diet, it restores the health of the intestinal lining fairly significantly.
And so can you walk us through how that structured water combined with sunlight and the Earth's, electromagnetic frequency, how that kind of ties into the cell and how those kind of interact together and how we can, again, like one of the thing in working with you, I've learned a ton. We've worked on these different modalities, but ultimately I have to take this on myself. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is one of the things, the most powerful things I think I learned from you was these 3 simple big rocks put together was a way that I could go and really advocate for myself, mm-hmm. right? And for my own health. And so mm-hmm. I think this is a great takeaway for people listening, like how they can really start to get that scaffolding, right? To get it right at the cell level.
Free of charge.
Yeah, free of charge.
One thing I'll circle, I'm going to just finish that water thing. We talked about the MBA obsession with Essentia water.
Yeah, thank you.
No disrespect to Essentia. I definitely purchase it on occasion when I don't have my water with me, or I'll buy the Mountain Valley water. But the NBA guys are obsessed with it. They buy cases of it. I think LeBron spent about $50,000 on it. And there's about 100 NBA guys that buy it by the pallet. right? And it doesn't make much sense on a lot of levels. One, you're storing it in plastic that is exposed to sunlight. So when you structure water, even when you drink water out of a Kangen machine, water is very unstable when you've created electrical changes in it. And so you really need to drink it fairly quickly after it's been created, and you can store it in kind of a dark brown container and sort of retain some of the structure, but you want to get it into the body in a structured form. And really the long-term goal is not to just drink a bunch of structured water externally. It's to make structured water yourself internally. Okay. So when we're getting to what you're talking about, which is kind of this way of creating structured water in the body, the earth has natural electromagnetic fields that are generated at the magnetic core, and they flow through the core of the earth onto the surfaces. And they're called Schumann resonances, and they're very low frequency electromagnetic fields. They're very gentle. And part of the job of those fields is to structure the water in your body to make it kind of more in a fourth phase, to give it the exclusion zones. The electrolytes in the water and the structured water and that kind of water base itself is essentially like the car battery when you fill it with water and electrolytes. It allows it to recharge itself. And then the sunlight is the photosynthetic element that allows the water to have an electrical charge. So this kind of combination of electromagnetism, photon exchange, biophotons coming into the body, and then the solution at which all of this interacts with essentially generates the important water structure of the body that is required to have any level of cellular health. And so you can totally do all those things naturally. And as you mentioned in your practice, we did that all the time. We basically did spend a lot of time without shoes on, walking the surfaces of the earth. We were in sunlight. We probably had very elevated vitamin D levels, especially equatorial dwellers. And so you have this natural rechargeable battery system that we call ATP and ADP that is essentially governed by these forces that are naturally occurring in the environment. And so reconnecting with those, first of all, is free.
And it feels, just from my experience, it fucking feels great to like actually, and again, it goes from doing to being, and you can do it. You can have a daily ritual around it. Yesterday, I was at my son Jake's soccer game down in San Antonio. It was kind of warm out yesterday. I get there, get to the game. I take my shoes off. I'm just in the grass watching the game. You can do that, Sometimes I'll take my shirt off. I know it's hard for the women to do that, but like, guys, don't worry about it. Don't, ultimately, don't fucking care about what the other parents think about you having your shirt off and it's 90 degrees and you're getting some sun. Like, fuck that. Like, Take
advantage.
Take your power back. Like you're there, you can do it all there. And if you go get some of the mountain spring water, that's better than some of the other stuff we can drink. And if you're fortunate enough to be able to get one of these Kangen machines, and you can do it all while you're watching your kids play soccer or baseball or whatever. And
you probably want 20 to 40 minutes, a day, especially in the times of year when it's possible. Obviously in the Midwest in the US or in the Northwest, you have the gray fall. It's much more difficult and you have to do other things. But interestingly, in Chinese medicine, there's a acupuncture meridian called the K1 channel, the kidney line, and the termination of that meridian is on the balls of your feet. And so that meridian also innervates all the organs, the yang meridian, so all the sort of sexual vitality, your ability to hold water in the body, your ability to not urinate all that water out is controlled by the strength of those organs. And so that K meridian, the termination point of it, or the beginning point, if you want to look at it that way, comes into contact with the earth. And so those free electrons literally come up through your feet into the body and innervate all those organs. The difference in like the West or in America, we have a lot of underground utilities that can make that grounding practice a little less effective, if not negative. But generally speaking, if you're around where there's native trees and you can kind of get onto the surface of the earth in the sunlight, that's what you want to do. But we're basically designed to allow plants to plug into the environmental battery that way, as opposed to putting our roots in the ground. The feet are our roots. So that's a really important practice and definitely has plenty of evidence to back it up. But it's what we've done for our entire time on this planet.
Yeah. So, and I know Peyton always gives me grief. She's like, I don't understand why we call it biohacking. This is like what we've always done. It's like, I understand, but this kind of the parlance of the times and whatever. But so with that, we'll just call this stuff biohacking. Like, go do that, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's simple,
absolutely.
it's free, and it feels
It's accessible to everybody.
It fucking feels really good,
It
you
does,
know?
yeah.
Now, there's a few other things. I mean, I've got a whole laundry list of things that we're going to have to do another podcast because there's a lot of things that I've learned over the years or the last 2 years from you. That again, I've tried to articulate to people. And I think they're fascinated. They want to know more. And I mean, the major reason I'm doing this podcast, right? And I told you this the other day is I've met people like you, right? And Kyle and my buddies up in Chicago. And I've learned these different things. And what I want to do, rather than have it be a one-off and me try to explain kind of my experience, I want to share my experience with the people who have really helped me. And I want their knowledge and their learning and their struggles and all that stuff, right? Of the tribe of people that I've come into contact with. I want to share that with the audience, right? And so, again, you and I are going to do multiple podcasts because there's just so many different directions that we can go in. And so I'm going to just I'm going to forgive myself for not covering everything today, but we're going to soldier on and cover a few more things that that I had thought about beforehand that I really wanted to tackle. One of those, and we're going to go brief now, okay? And we can expand upon this when people hit me up or hit you up on, you can hit me up on Instagram, Bunker Cal, and then I'll link to where you can get in touch with Ryan. But hit me up with any questions about this or Ryan, and because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about what we've covered, and we've covered a shit ton, and I've done the best I can to slow you down.
Yeah.
And but there's going to be a lot of stuff that people want to know more about, and so we'll tackle that, as they come in. So please, and I learned from my friend Kyle Kingsbury, I don't check my DMs on Instagram, so just comment on, the post where I promote this or anywhere on any one of my posts, and I will get back to you. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to do some quick hitters here.
Okay.
I think you talked about it briefly earlier, but let's talk a little bit about inherited trauma. In the book, when we started working together, you was required reading. Yep. It didn't start with you. My wife and I both read it, and it was amazing, and it really opened my eyes to what inherited trauma means. And so if you can just kind of break it down, is it still required reading?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's still required reading, why it's required reading, and what of the folks listening that this is a brand new concept to them, right? Just like it was a brand new concept to me, but I was coming to you at a time where I was opened up and like, fucking, I'll listen to anything. Like I had stopped with, I kind of opened up my belief system, right? And so can you explain it in a way, right, where people who this is the first time they've heard about inherited trauma can really kind of wrap their head around it?
Yeah. So we talk all the time about epigenetics. So that's just simply defined as the change in the expression of a gene without changing the gene sequence. So it's very important for relating to the environment. So inherited trauma is described in like metaphysical ways as like ancestral wounding and ancestral curses and things of that nature.
Give a couple examples from either from the book or what, because I think they're fascinating.
So like if you see a family of individuals and they all somehow manage to have the same traumatic experience, and the later generations oftentimes really do their best to not repeat these experiences, but it's just inevitable. So like I've seen everything from if a woman's great grandmother experienced sexual assault, it's very likely that the mom and the granddaughter will as well, at the same age, the same circumstances, etc. Let's say that in particular situations, I noticed that myself and many generations of my family respond exactly the same way. We collapse in the face of X stress. There's no coincidence in that, because trauma, in my opinion, is there in order to redirect kind of the trajectory of genetic expression. And so it has to be something that's visible and severe enough in order to kind of create a willful change around it. So basically what happens is that however our ancestors dealt with traumatic events, stressful events, however they responded to those, we're very likely to respond similarly in this way. And when we say epi, we mean that it's above the genome. So this is often invisible. And so when we embark on a healing journey, we will often find that the underwaters of that are entangling us in very invisible ways. So there's tendrils that have wrapped us up and are pulling us under. And we do all these things to try to override it in our own kind of present moment, but we actually need to go back and start looking at those traumas of the ancestors.
Is this something like, and I actually want to be clear, like this is in and of itself is an entire podcast. And so when we sit down again, I'd love to do a deep dive on this. It's fascinating to me.
Very deep, yeah.
But does this have to do, how does this relate to, I don't want to be like my dad was, right? Mm-hmm. But you're exactly like your dad was, even though like intellectually you're trying your damnedest not to be. Is that something that can be passed
It's similar, yeah, because I mean, almost all of us begin to resemble our parents.
And again, I don't know, shout out my dad, I love my dad, there are things that I didn't want to repeat.
Absolutely.
And I think he would agree with that. Yeah. And there are going to be things that my sons aren't going to want to repeat about what I've done.
The couple of points on it, we'll use a story from It Didn't Start With You. So there was a guy who woke up like with severe chills, shivering.
I was hoping you're going to get this. Blew me away.
There was no discernible problem with this person. Mystery illness.
Baseball player, right? Yeah, college baseball player?
Yeah, very
high level.
High level, just completely debilitated with this problem. And what ended up helping to resolve it is they went back and he realized that one of his uncles had drowned as a young man at the same age, right?
This is the guy, the power line. Remember he was working on the power lines up in Alaska, and it was like, it was in the morning at like 3 a.m. He froze to death.
Yeah.
And he would wake up in the middle. Was this the guy?
Yeah.
He would wake up in the middle of the night with these chills and couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
And then he was afraid to go to sleep because he'd have all this.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of, when I see mystery illnesses, like a lot of the times some family member suffered some horrific thing, and that person's manifesting the terror and the symptoms of it because they are transmitted through the germline. Those experiences, they modify gene expression. And so like that person might not have been sexually assaulted or drowned or whatever, but they're experiencing it as if they had. And there's no way to fix that unless you go through the kind of regression therapy to find that. So whether you want to talk about past life regressions or, holotropic breathing or whatever that's regressive that takes you back, that often is necessary. But in an everyday practical purpose or way, let's say your ancestors went through the Great Depression. Many of us, our ancestors did, and that was a very tough time and they were very stressed. So all of their responses to the environment were colored by that. Well, let's say we import that trigger happy stress response to modern traffic or upsetting news report. All of a sudden, we're responding to everyday events as if they're life and death occurrences. The problem of that, chemically speaking, is that when we get into our biochemistry, we're wired to survive and we're absolutely not wired to thrive at all. So when we're wired to respond in these hyper vigilant ways or hyper responsive ways, we're making excess histamines, excess adrenaline, we're upregulating cortisol. So all of these.
And what is the effect of excess histamines, for instance?
Brain fog, depression, inflammation, heightened allergy responses.
All bad.
Yeah, all bad stuff. I mean, elevated cortisol, it breaks down your hormones. It will start to impair sleep. I mean, it affects the
Ages
whole body,
you.
ages you very quickly. And then you become resistant to it. And then you basically have fatigue that's unresponsive. You can't even mount. So you're sort of like a zombie in some ways. So basically, the ancestors are informing many of the ways in which we're responding to our environments. And the males of the family control a lot of the stress responses. So the male and female lines have very different ways in which the inheritance that they pass through affects you. So your tendencies towards the environment and relationship, how you handle things, is largely colored by your ancestors' experiences. You can see, for instance, like, let's say, as you mentioned earlier, your mom, let's say you grew up in poverty and your mom was stressed at pregnancy. You're very much likely to be obese, to be an IV drug user. You're very much likely to generate all types of things because the DNA that you're inheriting is greatly damaged. And so those stress things are very important. The flip side of that, too, is like during pregnancy, you can actually rewrite a lot of the genetic expression for your children by doing the things during pregnancy to lower, for instance, homocysteine and other things. So our genes are definitely editable in terms of how we interface with the environment, and we actually have a fair degree of agency over that. So like we talked about those grounding and sunlight practices. Well, there are also other ways to hack that. So while biohacking may be revisiting the past, it's also very much localizing and amplifying the past and knowing what works. And so it isn't the same thing at all, actually.
Okay.
But when you know those kinds of things, or let's say I grew up around dad, and like if somebody upset him at work, I observed XYZ in his behavior. Well, let's say you start to unpack that you're doing the same thing. Well, we now know that you can make interventions around that. Or let's say dad has this really bad problem. He gets pissed off in traffic and he's mad for a month. Well, what's going on? Well, his BH4 cycle and methylation is not correcting and clearing neurotransmitters properly. Well, all of a sudden we can start to say, wow, there's some genetic inheritance. Then let's say in some cases, the events that create these long-standing irregularities in the brain also mirror like what grandfather went through when he was fired from the job, just like dad just was. Then we can say, wow, not only can we be conscious of the event, we might need to get into a family constellation therapy, which is what it didn't start with you, is rooted in. It's family constellation where we can actually use psychodrama and dramatic reenactments to work through these things.
Oh, yeah.
Through play expression. We can start to understand, which is the strength of it didn't start to you, is we are impaired absolutely by ancestral wounds. But it actually has tools to uncover them, right? The language.
Yes.
How do we understand mom and dad? What is the core language? And you start to unpack
core language, yeah,
the narrative aspect. And that's where those literary kind of backgrounds I have help, because you start to see the language piece of it. And there's all kinds of, different therapies that have been generated around that kind of stuff. But you start to see that. Then you start to say, okay, not only is the language there, there's a narrative aspect, but then the chemicals in the body are also helping to create this stuff. And our genes and our body wants the highest level of expression. Nature and life itself seeks harmony, evolution, and the highest levels of its expression. And so when you begin to be aware of those dimensions, it allows you to actually move things to a totally new place. And so genetics will behave deterministically as long as your epigenetic potential is altered or wounded. But these things help you to unpack that. And all that's happening when it's representing in your life is that's life itself unfolding through your genealogy, wanting to be better, wanting to be healthier. So it sucks that a lot of us do pay for the sins of our fathers, so to speak, right? But it's not like that's inevitable.
You can break the cycle. That's the beauty,
you absolutely
right?
Can. You can.
Well,
you absolutely can.
Well, you know what was interesting for me in my experience with that book, and I did not see this coming at all. Anyone who knows me and my mom, we have a super tight relationship. I love my mom to death. But when I went through one of the practices, I had some feelings going on with her, right? And then part of the practice is seeing her as a child and what her life was like, and like just really just creating this like bit of empathy. And I just remember seeing my mom in a completely different light, that she once was a baby. She once was a child. And I don't think I'd ever thought about my mom and dad in that way. They'd always been grownups to me. And you forget And I love Joe Rogan always talks about how he looks at people as just grown up babies. They're little babies. And like I think that creates some empathy for him around people. Like we're just overgrown babies
Yeah.
trying to figure it out, And so
That book's all about, the fundamental point of the book is most of us who have familial dramas and issues, we basically run from them, which is what we do when we've already been talking about sort of the act of running or compensating, right?
yeah, distracting, numbing, like booze, exercise,
whatever it is,
whatever
you're
the
running,
thing is.
you're running from the beast.
Yep.
But the book makes a very powerful point that you need your family.
Yeah.
And so I resonated with it on that regard because I didn't want to repeat my family history. I ended up doing it.
Yep.
But I realized I needed them, but that doesn't mean I need them in my life if they're dysfunctional and toxic. What it means is that I have to integrate them and I have to forgive them. I think that's fundamental about that book, that you need to forgive these people. And when you think about your parents, like I can look back now, I didn't have a father and my mom had undue responsibility that was above and beyond. But I now realize basically I got as best as she had to offer. She was fallible. I wanted more, but that's just what she had. And like, I was angry and I could feel the anger, but then I could feel like, look, that's just the circumstances. And she cared.
And I want to highlight that because that's been a big part of my learning, right? My growth, my understanding. It's, not only the self-forgiveness that you and I've talked about, but like, forgiving those in your life where you feel like they maybe came up short. I mean, everybody really does give the best that they have. And when I look objectively at how I've been as a dad, right? There's a lot of shit that I'm not proud of that I wish I had done differently, and still to this day, I still struggle with things like how I would express myself, right? I think I'm in a much more, I'm on a much more awakened path as a father now, but there's a lot of stuff where I came up short. And I'm gonna, hopefully my kids will forgive me for that stuff. But I think it's important to release those people in your life. There's a famous expression, right? Like you can't choose your family. Well, that's fine, but to your point, you still have to make amends with that inheritance.
But if you look at your family, like for many years, perhaps I wanted a different one, but if you look at them, so I think a couple big, just kind of 30,000 foot viewpoints about it is you have to make amends and forgive your family. All of us have to do that because they're never going to be what we want them to be. I also think in doing that, you also learn to set boundaries and individuate because you can start to disentangle yourself. So that's part of it. Just because people's imprints are flowing through you, you have respect for history and you have that, but you can also say, I respect that history, but it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to program my future. So I think one of the things that I want to be cautious about is if your family is destructive, forgive them, but don't welcome them into your field because you do need to be able to set really firm boundaries. The other thing is that I think, like, generally speaking, if any of us actually get through this work of forgiving and reconciling the cards that were dealt, I don't think many people would actually want to change it. So I think not only did I have mostly forgiven my family, but I'm actually thankful that they were my family in spite of them most of the time being destructive because they had been possessed a ton of gifts that I also got access to.
Well, right, and I think there's
and you love them for that, and you appreciate their struggle, and it just decharges that whole lack of availability maybe that they have. But you can see, man, I do come from gifted people, and they're very special in their own right, and you can appreciate the struggles that they waged to try to have a life. And most of our family, if you go back far, they didn't have the tools that we have. And so I think that's a big part of it. The other part of it is a lot of what we're talking about is shining light onto the shadows to make the shadow disappear. So whether you want to go to Jungian psychology or Joseph Campbell or whatever and look at that, I'm always reminded of the scene in that fish, The Big Fish, that movie, The Big Fish, where that werewolf's coming into town and tearing everybody up and killing everybody. And people live in sort of avoidance of this thing. They hide at night. Well, the one character realizes that all that wolf wanted to do is play fetch, and they play fetch. They get engaged with the shadow and they play fetch, and it turns it into acceptance and peace and play. And I think that there's a lot of that, and to realize like the amount of programming that's flowing through your family and how much of that they're unable to unpack. And you basically realize how sensitive and fragile life is itself. And I think the more gratitude that comes out of the fact that you're alive in spite of maybe being birthed by folks that you didn't necessarily choose, if you so describe or subscribe to that position, I kind of think we do choose.
That was what I was going to say. Yeah.
I'm more of a Buddhist in that sense, that we choose our family. But yeah, certainly it's all of what we're talking about is sort of rebelling against these films that are over our being and not realizing that they're there and kind of constantly being restricted by them, almost stuck in a sticky web. And then when you start to realize that you can literally decide in the moment to let them go, it's pretty ironic.
Well, I love what you said too, the language you used, the decharging, because I think family, friends, people, they charge us, right?
Yep.
And then they take us off kind of course for what we should be doing, right? And we get kind of distracted with the narrative of my dad was this, my mom was that, my sister, my brother, aunt, uncle, whatever. And so I think decharging is a great way to describe that.
And there's other things like that we'll talk about in the future, like human design. How does that factor into it? Didn't start with you. One of the ways it does is here's what mom's type is. And in fact, it was diametrically opposed to my type, and therein lies our conflict. And but I respect this person, and I now know how to negotiate with better tools based on mutual understanding.
Yeah.
Because basically, all we're trying to do is get our needs met in the most like circuitous ways. And there's a lot of tools to kind of take the information of the past, relational technologies that you can use to kind of come together and deal with this stuff, and then gain that respect and reverence, but also forgiveness. And it's a moving target for sure. But to me, this is just as much, and if not, probably the most important part of the work is settling on who you are and where you are in space and time, and where you came from and where you're going, and actually having a very high level of intention behind all of that.
Yeah, because I was listening to Adyashanti recently, and he talked about that. He's like, when you start to give, you play the victim, and so makes me feel this way, and I'm triggered by this, and it's like you're giving all your power away, and you're saying that person has agency over you for what you can do, how you can feel. And it's like when you just continue to give away, when you want to believe that victim narrative, you're kind of fucked. You're at the whim of whoever you feel victim to.
Push that button. Yeah. And a lot of that, which he doesn't get into so much, is that you do have those traumas. So like when people go in for like a trauma therapy, whatever it is, I often tell them, don't try to figure out like what dad did to you or that car accident. Why don't you just go in with what irritates you in your everyday life right now, which is like, oh, this asshole cut me off, or looked at me wrong, and that will quickly take the elevator down into the core wounding.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that. And then there's also like when you walk into environments carrying the energy of expectant conflict with somebody, and you basically don't allow that environment to ever generate a different result. So like couples, for instance, when they start to become kind of disconnected, will often expect conflict as soon as the door opens and they share space. And there's been many studies that shown if one party can withdraw that expectation of what's going to happen or what has been happening, they end up being able to come together in a way, because they're just not recreating that constant drama, right? But we do it.
Peyton and I definitely danced that one for a while.
We all do, and we love it. Let's face it. One of the things I talked to my mom about recently, when I was an undergrad, I was kind of a socially awkward geek, and still am. But like, I didn't go out, I didn't party. You'd find me reading philosophy on a Friday night. But I remember like I would put on really sad ambient music and like try to make myself cry. Like I actually felt good
Yeah.
in that pain. And I utilized that like to express myself. And now I like that I don't have that as an option anymore. It's pretty funny, like how much I use drama, sadness, melancholy to like feel.
Mm.
And now that I don't want to do that anymore, like it changes the whole dynamics of what I'm seeking out in relationships.
It opens you up to different
Yeah. Or like,
experiences and different people. And yeah.
my first real love that, I was with 6-7 years, that we broke up my first semester in my PhD, all the years that I held on to that. But thank God, she broke my heart, because the person that I'm with now is so much better for me. And like, I actually have real love. But even we've gone from like near breakups over small arguments to like, we can say just, hey, why are we being so stupid right now?
Yeah.
We can laugh at each other and appreciate it. So you bring levity to these charged situations, and you find out, it was really bad, but it's even kind of funny on the back end, like how this is happening.
Yeah.
Just the absurdity of life comes to the forefront, and like you appreciate it more.
Well, I think that's another important thread through this whole thing is like, life is kind of absurd. Like, just laugh at it every now and then. Don't take shit so seriously, everyone. Like, we let's have some fun with this, and again, laugh at ourselves. Like, we're idiots sometimes, and it's kind of funny.
Yeah, we are. I mean, one of the things that came up there is kind of unrelated, but my mom is like always like, I'm going to make a video of this world famous biohacker like drinking his Dr. Pepper, and like putting that out there, showing who you really are. And I'm like, well, I've pretty much told people that, but that kind of, because you mentioned the Instagram, like cultivated personality that we're all sort of like weirdly striving towards or trying to be an influencer. And the reality is like, we're all messy as hell, and you should be transparent about that. Human design has helped me to accept the fact that I am a kind of, when people hurt my feelings, I withdraw, I pout, I go away for days at a time. Like, I used to really be upset about myself about that. Now I'm just like, you're going to get the good me and the bad me a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I'm not going to continue to work to leverage that into the good direction, but you just become more self-accepting through all of that. And appreciation and gratitude isn't like something to kind of top down pursue. And a lot of people do that. Like my mantras and my gratitude journal. Well, the reason why people don't stick to that is because it's not, you don't arrive there.
Yeah, and you're not taking into account like the shadow side of like the shit that happens with you. That it's part, like, you can't disown those parts. You have to own all of it, all of your shit, and all the good stuff. Like, it's all part of you. And
ironically, people actually are love you more.
Yeah,
and if they don't, then they're not right for you. I mean, but that's the other irony, like that goes back through all what we're talking about, especially men, and that's another conversation. But like, you're trying to cultivate that strength and the kind of economic viability and your physical appearance and all these things, right? And like, all of your quirks and shadows often get really kind of curated and managed, and yet you end up not being surrounded by people that actually care about you.
Yeah.
You're playing a role for them, and your mask don't come off at night, and you get broken down, but it's absolutely beautiful. Like the mankind stuff that we'll talk about.
Yep.
The demasking of yourself, and like, man, people actually love me as I am. I can be overweight, angry, kind of moody, whatever it is that I'm labeling, I can be that, and people still are in my corner. And I've seen all my relationships get better in relation to doing that acceptance work, which it's all real cliche, but it's really not, because doing the work is very different than talking about it. And that's kind of another point of contention we can get into at some point, like the lack of ritual work daily that helps you to do this, because a lot of the people that we study and want to emulate are actually doing and using tools that they're not actually being transparent that they're using. Some of the like metaphysical magic and things like that. So there's a lot of other things that come out of this where you start to have a more magisterial like relationship to the world every day, because you're engaging in ritual and behaviors and habits that actually produce change outside of yourself.
Yeah, and I think something that has affected both of us is the men's group that I started, I don't know, a year and a half ago. And it was just this idea that, I met Kyle, and through Kyle Kingsbury, I met you. And through you, I met John Cole, and I met Matt Fisher.
Mhm.
And then I met Josh O'Brien. And so I'm meeting this group. And now all of a sudden, to your point, like I'm surrounded by people that I'm just getting to know, but feel this immense love and support from.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
we've come into, and again, this podcast is another extension of that. It's like to show other men, right, and women, but like and I think women do a better job of this than men.
Absolutely.
But find your tribe, find those that will show up for you, and have different tribes. I have a tribe of my brothers from Chicago where we spend a lot of time together.
Have
And I have
different tribes.
right. But be intentional about that and who is part of your tribe and how you're showing up for them. And I think that's been such a powerful thing for me as we've been in Austin 6 years. It took me 4+ years to really find that deep connection with other men where we go there, where we show up for one another, and where there's no, as best as we can do, right? There's no masks. I mean, we're always going to have some sort of mask on, but we really show up as who we are.
Can
It's
admit that.
fucking awesome,
Yeah.
So anyway, I know we're running short on time. I'm going to do, these are some therapies and modalities that you've introduced to me, and I want, a minute or less on each of these. And this is stuff that people are going to have a lot of questions about, but I want you to just, the best you can, the kind of the why behind them, why you think they're important, and whatnot. And so this will just be like a little quick hitting. All right. Meditation, and in particular, transcendental meditation.
So transcendental meditation is a mantra-based meditation that you learn via a teacher who assigns a mantra that's typically given based on your age. I have found it to be the easiest, most natural form of meditation that is done twice a day for 20 minutes, ideally. And I settled on that after 9 or 10 years of believing that it was some kind of cult and thought that it was ridiculous that you had to pay. My own resistance is there. I've just found it to be effortless because it uses sort of a charm to kind of get your mind to drop into those deeper places by giving it something to be attentive to. And you can't knock the results of all the folks that practice it.
Yeah, and perfect. And that was my first experience with meditation. And now I feel much more comfortable playing around with these different forms because I have this practice with TM. That's the beauty of TM, is it's very consistent and it creates some aptitude around how to meditate. And
it doesn't get into the pain of like Vipassana or insight where you're like fighting the pain in your body and following your breath. And there's a version of something called heart-centered meditation that's coming up quite a bit now. That's a sort of Christian practice, but it's similar to TM, except you have a word that you use just periodically to stop thought. They're similar, 20 minutes twice a day. But yeah, it's effortless. And the art, all the amount of folks in the world that practice this stuff, you can't argue with the success of the individuals. I mean, all the artists and successful folks do it, and there's a reason why. And it definitely, there's thousands of studies that they've done on it. And I've noticed that when I do practice it, which I haven't in a while,
hand up, me too.
People definitely gravitate towards you because you have a lightness and a joy and less judgment.
Yeah.
And you can get experiences with TM that would take years doing like Buddhist meditation. So it's accessible and it can be taught to children as well, which is amazing.
Okay. So next, Kangen water. We already talked about that. Cold water therapy. Why is it important?
So if you had to pick like two modalities that can really transform health, one would be kind of the sun and the grounding and heat, like saunas, and cold water would be the other. Cold water just initiates all types of recovery and repair pathways in the body. And it's especially so if you combine it with breath work. Really, it needs to be combined with intentional breath work in order to kind of link up all the physiological processes. But it's designed to send signals in the body, and it has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties. Specifically, we're talking about cold water, 50 to 57 degrees. And in comparison to like cryotherapy, cold water is found throughout the world. Cryotherapy, there's no way in anywhere in the world where you're negative 230 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever. Right. So the cold water actually just has, the effects are numerous. That's the whole podcast in of itself.
Yeah. And so when you say coupled with breath work, before, during, after, like...
During.
Yep.
So like the success of Wim Hof, for instance, which everybody's going to be familiar with, is that he does the cold alongside the breath work. And the reason for that is to kind of keep the pain from manifesting. So all that sort of the acid byproducts I talk about, the breath helps to deal with that. But the breath also helps the nervous system integration and activation of the relaxation response and things like that the cold helps to generate.
Well, so in this summer, I had there's any number of ways to get your cold water therapy in, but I had I think a 15 cubic foot freezer.
Yep.
And would get into the mid 30s, and I had a number of people who went in there for the first time, and they were able to do it for a minute or 2 minutes, and it was simply and the only thing I would coach them on is the breath, and get to the breath, and it's going to be a bit in the beginning, but if you can just extend the breathing, the inhale, the hold, the exhale, and just over time they just would continue to throughout the experience, and there was nobody who couldn't do it. And I was amazed because when I first got in water, it was like maybe it was 57, 58, 60 degrees, and I had a son of a bitch of a time. But to your point, if you just can spiritually get to that place and breathe.
Yeah, that's why you don't want to go cold. You want to use your thermocouple and make sure you're keeping it at 50 to 57. Because you need to stay in for a certain period of time. Also, when you recoil from the cold, that tells you a lot about your leptin sensitivity and some of your hormones. So like the more you tolerate cold, the more metabolically viable you are as a person.
Okay.
So the better your mitochondria are functioning, the more brown adipose tissue you have. So there's a lot of ways in which you can use it diagnostically to kind of assess your hormone states and things
assessing,
like that.
So the first time I do it, it doesn't assess me. But if I do it over 6 months and I'm doing it, will it actually, as I become more acclimated to it, will it improve those other things?
Absolutely. I mean, it drastically improves sex hormone production, balances leptin. The more brown adipose tissue you manufacture, which is metabolically active fat, like it causes dramatic changes, but you can diagnostically assess right away. Anytime you go to that, that your cold sensibilities and your tolerance is poor. It also tells you a lot about your thyroid function. You're probably already clinically low in your body temp naturally when you recoil like that.
Okay. And again,
better to use in the winter too than the summer, to be honest. They all love the Chinese heat in the summer, cold in the winter, which is kind of the opposite of how we use it, right? We like it when it's 90 out, but when it's 40 out and you're in cold ass water, it's a different thing.
Yeah.
But I've seen better results that way.
We'll have a lot more to talk about all these things on a future podcast. And again, if you want to reach out to us. But I'm going to try to keep this brief because Ryan's got a tight schedule here. Celery juice.
So celery juice is one of the concoctions of the medical medium.
Yeah.
He believes it cures everything. It does not.
Okay.
This is one of the things that I now don't recommend. So this is a thing that
Perfect, because this is something I did for a while.
Yep. So it definitely helps people with like bowel function, and if they have stomach and digestive issues, it can calm some of that. The problem is it is high in sulfur, and it's not the cure-all that it's supposed to be. So basically what celery juice is providing you are what are called cellular salts. Mm-hmm. There are these salts that are used for metabolic processes, and you can actually take something called bioplasma, which is a homeopathic cell salt that contains all of it, and it replaces celery juice, and it's a lot better because it's sulfur-free. But basically, it gives your body a kind of charge electrically and provides a lot of these things that you would use in chemical reactions on the energy side.
What's it called again?
Bioplasma.
Okay, and we'll link to that.
Yeah,
we'll link to that.
That's great stuff. So that's the same thing. Celery juice, if you're up for it, is great, but it's a lot of work to pull it off. It's a lot of celery juice, 16 to 32 ounces.
Ton, yeah.
And now that I found something that works just as well, I used cell salts for years, but I found they work just as well.
Okay, great.
The medical medium is what it is, but it works for a lot of folks. I don't want to denigrate it, but there's better things.
Well, I love that.
More convenient.
I love that this is an example of something that a protocol that you recommended, and now you don't. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for not defending that anymore.
Yeah.
How about the sea salt morning flush?
So the sea salt flush is not for the faint of heart, as you know. there's two levels that it's used. So like if you put less salt, it's just a great way to get the adrenal glands and the body's kind of switches thrown without having to secrete adrenal hormones.
So in the morning, like a pinch of some
A
Himalayan
little bit
sea-
more than that, like
Okay.
about an eighth to a quarter teaspoon and a cup
Okay.
of water is a great way to just kind of flip your switches without having to produce those catecholamine hormones. But the salt flushing, the way that you were doing it, was to prepare for deeper level detoxification. So salt is a halide kind of molecule, and so it helps to displace bromine and fluoride in the body. So it helps to bind up a lot of environmental toxins and remove them out of your system. And if you do that for a few months at a time, when you do get ready to do a very deep level, like heavy metal detox, you will have a much easier time because your liver, spleen, gallbladder will be a lot more functional. And so I use it to get rid of those halogen and halides in the body that are blocking iodine absorption at the thyroid because they have the same molecular weight. So salt's a really wonderful detoxifier, but it's a lot of salt. It's like swilling straight out of the Gulf.
It sucks.
And it produces some pretty crazy bowel
Which is, it
responses.
can be fun, but if you've got somewhere to go,
Yeah, it's very
like,
difficult to do in a normal work or life scenario.
Yeah, I was fortunate that I had I could plan it my day around it, but
But it's very helpful for those that can do it. But it takes 1 to 2 months of really earnest work, and it is it's hard to do. It's something I personally have a very difficult time doing. So it's a do as I say, not as I do. Sometimes for me.
Okay, so here's one that I think a lot of people are familiar with, the sauna, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, briefly, because we can talk about this stuff all day. Near infrared, far infrared, like where do you sit with what is the kind of best practice to use?
So there's a lot of wonderful saunas out there. There's the old steam saunas, there's rock saunas, there's like the barrel sauna, and then there's the infrared sauna. So I do like the Sunlighten Impulse, which has near, mid, and far infrared.
Okay.
It's another form of photobiomodulation, red light therapy. It will upregulate enzymes that help make antioxidants. It's a wonderful method for detoxifying environmental chemicals and pesticides and metals because you're using the dermis and avoiding the organ pathways. The thing about the sauna, generally speaking, is that you need to combine the use of antioxidants and some preliminary stuff as you do it in order to kind of facilitate the removal of toxins if that's what you're after. I prefer infrared saunas generally because the temperature at which you're in there is lower. The amount of toxins per loss of water in the body is higher than any of the other saunas. But I do think that, it's one of the most important tools that one could have because you can generate endless outcomes. And there's tons of things I could talk about, but I mean, it reduces immune complexes. It helps to clear a lot of inflammatory molecules. I mean, there's an endless amount of things that it does. There's some articles on the website for Xenogenesis about it, some very lengthy things about what it does and what the spectrums do.
Okay, perfect.
But
We'll link to that.
But if you had to invest in some stuff, if you did a cold plunge in a sauna, as far as your health investment, you'd basically be able to really produce some dramatic health transformation and keep yourself healthy.
And today you're recommending the Sunlighten version because it's got the near,
the mid, near, and far.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all three of them.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's talk a little bit. TRE, just real brief.
Trauma release exercises invented by a guy named David Berceli. Very effective trauma therapy. Probably is something you want to do supervised in the beginning because it can open you up quite a bit. But basically, it's a set of exercises that generate a tremoring response in your body, which is a natural mechanism for all mammals to release trauma.
Like, what do they show the example of, like the duck or something that,
or the zebra that runs away, or the goat? They run, it freezes, and then it shakes, and then it's back again, as long as it's escaped those predators. So we have that also, and we control it largely with our mind, so we don't allow it to manifest. Trauma release exercise, profound. You do that 2 or 3 times a week for a couple of months in earnest, and a lot of PTSD will resolve naturally.
And I went through that with our good friend Matt Fisher.
Yeah,
he's amazing. A dear brother of ours. Yeah. And that was, I didn't have the PTSD, so to speak, but it was amazing for me.
It just softens you.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
was like delayering,
Yeah.
all that armoring for me. So that was
Absolutely.
awesome. Let's talk a little bit about time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, condensed eating window, like that, like in essence, like what is your
Okay.
recommendation for?
So this is one of these one things where I've gone and settled on something after starting somewhere else. So time restricted eating is different than intermittent fasting. Actually, Rhonda Patrick just released a thing saying what we think is intermittent fasting is not, et cetera. So time restricted eating basically is, in my definition, eating diurnally, which means when the sunlight is out, trying to get some food in within 30 minutes of waking, and then terminating your eating is before dark if you can.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to keep people in 5 to 10 hour eating windows daily with continuity. And so what all that means is that the restriction is you're only eating within that window of time that's defined. There's plenty of people that disagree with me about this, that think it's better to skip and eat later in the day and kind of do other things in between. But I have found clinically reliable, consistent transformation of all types of biomarkers with that form, as opposed to like the 816 of like lean gains or the eat, stop, eat, all these kind of different ones that are promoted. I found that the diurnal window, shrinking it as much as you can. If you can get down to a 6 hour window, that's where I've seen the most results.
And what we've talked about is, you say you start out let's say you start out in the middle of the summer, because that's when the sun is out the longest. That's when your eating window is the largest.
Larger. Yeah. So good point there. So my eating and my kind of research on diet, more carbohydrates when there's more sunlight in the environment, less carbohydrates when there's not. So your window gets larger as the sunlight window gets larger, and it shrinks as it gets smaller. If you have cancer and you have autoimmunity and other things, you're much better going to 5 and 6 hour windows. Also, because I know genetics, if I see genetic problems with autophagy and cell and DNA repair, the window needs to get smaller and smaller. You have to force the body much more aggressively. So most folks, even ones that claim they intermittent fast, eat about 15 hours a day.
Yep.
You need a minimum of 12 hours of no food, nothing actually, no supplements, no tea, no bulletproof coffee, water only. Yeah.
Okay. I knew that, but I didn't like to hear that.
Yeah. It's a tough one.
We've talked about a little bit about breath work. We don't need to go into that. Grounding. Okay. The beamer.
Yeah.
Talk. I know we spoke about it before, but to talk just in essence what the beamer.
The beamer mat. So beamer is a PEMF mat. It has a native set of pulsed electromagnetic fields that it generates through coils, and you lay on it, and it essentially acts as a biocharger, but it raises ATP, decouples red blood cells. It, in my opinion, enhances microcirculation. So that's the biggest element of it, is this microcirculation enhancement, which is going to increase nutrient synthesis, hormone production, clearance of waste through the lymphatics. It's crucial. The amount of micro vessels that we have as opposed to kind of arteries and veins is dramatic. I mean, I forget how many thousands of miles it is, but it restores your plumbing essentially. And the beamer is German. The beamer is definitely not alone in the environment of PEMF technologies, but in my opinion, it's the only one that really does its job because it's gentle and it's pulsing. There is one called IMRS, and then there's all these ones that have like rings and they are very high intensity. You actually don't want those super high intensity PEMF waves. They actually can be quite shocking to the cells. And so plenty of people would disagree, and I welcome them to. I can explain it in a lot more detail, but the beamer mat is just a wonderful tool for globally supporting the circulatory effects in the body and charging your batteries. And it's awesome because it's two times a day for 8 minutes. So it's doable, but it has to be done kind of consistently to work. But I really respect it. And I actually did not buy the beamer entirely until I read Thomas Cowan's book about the heart. And then I realized those vortices and those plasma states that he's seeking in the blood and in the water, the beamer was actually generating a lot of that kind of stuff. And so those microcirculation studies from Germany that I was reading, all of a sudden when I read Cowan, it kind of put it together, and I was like, okay, the beamer is legit. Because other ones use heart rate variability to determine doses, and I thought they were better. So this is another example I thought the IMRS for a long time was better until I really started to buy the Beamer technology.
Yep.
It's another one like the Kangen water that's sold by all kinds of people that don't know what they're talking about. So
Yep.
it gives it a really bad name.
Gotcha. Okay. And Dr. Thomas Cowan has written a few books that you've recommended to me that have been amazing. And I've recommended them and given them out to a lot of my friends. But the one,
Human Heart, Cosmic Heart. Yeah.
Yeah. Really good.
Thomas Cowan is sort of like my intellectual doppelganger. We're like almost working on always the same things, the same recs. So he's just more well known than I am, but like we're very much similar in a lot of things, except I have the genetic piece.
Yep.
But yeah, he's one of my guys, one of the people I highly respect.
Awesome. And then one of the things you introduced me to recently, and I got one at the house, was the WAF Elite.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about that. I mean, it looks like a big pool toy that my Peyton had.
Everybody
a lot
makes
of fun. Yeah. Spent 10 times more than you would have on the pool toy.
Yeah. So the WAF is a big inner tube looking thing that's patented, which essentially allows you to totally deload your skeleton and nervous system. It takes the proprioceptors basically into an anti-gravity kind of situation, and it rapidly rebalances nervous system function in about 20 minutes of time. It was invented by an osteopath in Beverly Hills who's French origin, who works with NFL and NBA players, and his name unfortunately escapes me, but it's an amazing tool for mounting a relaxation response. But you got to stay on it. But it's one of my preferred tools. It is about $450 for the big WAF Elite. They also make smaller ones that we have in our space that like LeBron uses for proprioception training called the WAF Mini. But a friend of mine, I've known about it, but a friend of mine kind of made sure that I bought one because he started using it, and we've been very happy with what you can do. But a daily use of something like that, again, is one of these things where you don't have to like meditate or do a whole much. It's low hanging fruit because it's a lot easier to pull off as a routine because you just lay there.
It's awesome. And I'll say, my experience with, well, so for one thing, it's supposed to somewhat mimic
flotation tank without being in a deprivation. But of course, you're not totally sensory deprived.
No.
But it does have a lot of the similar effects of floating in that kind of weightless sit. And if you black out your eyes or do some other things, you can get pretty close, and you catch a lot larger population that doesn't want to get in a dark tank and float.
And I have mine out in my workout area. And so as soon as I'm done with a hard workout, maybe it's a hard Peloton ride or something like that, I lay down on that sucker for 20 minutes. Sometimes I'll put in a guided meditation or something, and I'm off.
It's a great tool to use alone or to combine with other things. You could even do your TM if you learn that on it.
Yeah.
You know? But I found that it's really a cool toy and a very serious device, but it looks like a big inner tube.
Yeah.
That's always the first thing. Oh, well, how's this different than floating on the river? It's like very different. There's patents on this, but okay.
Yeah. There's a little sticker shock when you're like,
there is a $450 piece of plastic, but it's worth it.
But it's worth it. I agree.
Yeah.
And then, you mentioned Netflix earlier, and you've always got great recommendations for me. What is something recently you've watched on Netflix that you think has maybe either shifted how you think about things or people might find interesting?
Honestly, when I watch Netflix, I'm being very transparent. I'm mostly doing it for escape.
Yeah, okay.
So
any documentaries that you've seen on there?
There's one right now called Unnatural Selection, which is about biohackers. Specifically, it's about what we call grinders and implanters who are using like what I would call biopunk. They're putting devices in themselves.
I just started watching that the other night. Yeah.
So Josiah Zahner I actually know Josiah pretty well. He's probably the most intelligent person in that group. Aaron Trawick was in there, which he had developed a vaccine for herpes simplex 2 and was working on HIV and somehow ended up dying in a float tank because of very suspicious circumstances, but he's in the documentary as well.
I remember him.
Wow. He died about 2 months after body hacks in Austin. I actually saw him do that injection on himself. It's interesting. It definitely is very Pollyannish in terms of like biohacking being, or gene editing specifically, but it's definitely worth watching. And Josiah is somebody to know about because he's teaching people how to do CRISPR editing at home. And he has this company called the Odin. And I think he's smart. He went to the University of Chicago, some PhD in biophysics. But it's just interesting to see what people are doing and to kind of get a sense of it, but just know that that's kind of a glimpse of that world. I also like The Magic Pill, which is a documentary about keto, especially with children with autism and developmental disabilities. I think it shows very clearly a well-constructed therapeutic keto diet's effects, and also looks at the effects of like Western foods on like the Aboriginal population. So I think both of those. And then there's one, the name's escaping me, but you can find it. It's got Pete Davis, who is an Australian chef, but he goes and talks to everybody from the creator of the GAPS diet, Terry Walls, all these different people. And he talks to them about their kind of ancestrally oriented diets and philosophies, and then they cook together. And so I found that it's called like the Paleo Kitchen or something like that. It's a series.
Okay.
But in terms of what we're talking about, those are really cool ones.
Okay, awesome. Well, how about this? And I did want to ask you, and again, I know you got to go, so we'll keep it brief. But if you can, where do you see your practice going in the next 5 or 10 years? Where do you kind of, what is your kind of vision for the work you're doing right now?
It's a tough one. I feel like my work with humans will probably be buttoned up in the sense of like I'm getting close to figuring out protocols that are reproducible. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I've gotten, not that I've gotten done learning, but I feel like I've figured out enough to be able to start working more on environmental stuff. So I'm very much interested in like environmental restoration and land imprinting and things like that. So I imagine I'll be incorporating kind of environmental healing work at a higher level and scale in the future in 5 to 10 years. The big thing I'm trying to figure out is just like a very reproducible set of interventions to fix the waters in the body, and kind of doing that in minimum effective doses. So metabolic restoration is kind of what I'm after, like full scale metabolic restoration. And of course, I'm referring kind of, obliquely to cancer work. But most of my research these days is on cancer.
Okay, and then I should ask, how did you get the name Xenogenesis?
So Xenogenesis was arrived at somewhat organically, but also kind of, I didn't realize that the seed was planted a long time ago. So there's a science fiction writer named Octavia Butler, African-American writer. She's no longer with us. Very much into kind of genetic engineering and things of that nature. If you haven't read any of her stuff, I recommend it. So she wrote a book called the Xenogenesis Trilogy, which was sort of about the collapse of the earth and then the return to the earth with all these kind of newly mented beings that were hominoid types. Xenogenesis is a lab term, which means a genetic offspring that has no resemblance to the parent stock. So that was sort of what I was after, is like unhinging us in a good way, or untethering us from our genetic inheritance and history, kind of the stuff we've been talking about, so that we're completely individuated, powerful, kind of in control of ourselves.
Not the victim
of circumstances, and not locked into this deterministic, preordained sort of future. And so there are animals that are engineered and genetic kind of outcomes that they've done in the lab, and they call it xenogenetic offspring. But the term was really just to strive for this idea of total healing, total liberation, but doing it in a respectful way where we're bound by kind of love and concern for one another, but not bound by dysfunction and kind of injured genetics.
Okay.
So that's kind of where it came from. And then using really high-tech tools that are sort of sacred in their orientation of capturing like elemental forces. So high-tech and sci-fi, but also totally rooted in reality of like the biology of Earth. So that's kind of where we settled on that.
Awesome. And then where can people reach you?
So you can reach me on the genetic functional medicine, the stuff I talk about at cosmicanimal.com.
And we'll link to all this in the show notes. But
and then if you're in Austin, Xenogenesis is in the east side. We're off of MLK, about 3 or 4 blocks west of Airport Boulevard. And our website is xenogenesis.co. So it's with an X, and that'll be there. And any of the tools that I've referenced, you can read about. I've written about the 8 core technologies extensively, including structured water. And feel free to come in and see us and see what you want to try to do. But we're all about kind of 2 to 3 times a week and changing and transforming so that you actually have permanent scaffolding. That's what we're about, and doing it in very short amounts of time. So the therapies average between 10 and 45 minutes.
Yep.
very quick.
And I can attest to that.
Yeah.
So anyway, brother, I mean, the first of many.
Yeah.
Loved
absolutely.
having you on. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing all that
Thanks
that
for
you
the-
shared.
thanks for the
And
conversation.
I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely.
All right, brother.
Peace.